Chapter 1. Failure's Echo. The antiseptic smell of the hospital was supposed to be comforting, clean, sterile, safe. Instead, it reminded Naruto of everything he wasn't. Clean conscience, sterile record of success, safe haven for those he was supposed to protect. He stared at the ceiling tiles above his hospital bed, counting the hairline cracks that spiderwebbed across their surface like the fractures in his own resolve. 47 visible cracks. He'd counted them 6 times now. Anything to avoid looking at the bandages wrapped around his torso or the concerned faces of the medical staff who whispered just outside his hearing range. Whispered. Everything was whispers now. The door creaked open, and Nurse Tanaka entered with her clipboard and forced smile. She'd been avoiding his eyes for 2 days now, ever since he'd been brought in more dead than alive, carried on a stretcher with Sasuke's absence hanging over the entire mission like a funeral shroud. "How are we feeling today, Naruto-kun?" Her voice held that particular tone adults used when they were trying very hard to be gentle. The same tone they'd used when they told him the Hokage was dead. "Fine," he mumbled, though the word tasted like ash. Nothing was fine. Nothing would ever be fine again. She made a note on her clipboard, still not meeting his eyes. "Your injuries are healing remarkably well. The Nine-Tails chakra certainly has its benefits." There it was. The pause. The slight hesitation before the word benefits. As if she couldn't quite bring herself to call the demon sealed inside him a blessing. As if she knew, like everyone else seemed to know, that he was more curse than miracle. "When can I leave?" Naruto asked, though he wasn't sure where he wanted to go. Back to his empty apartment? Back to the training grounds where Kakashi-sensei would look at him with that expression of barely concealed disappointment? Back to a village that had sent him to retrieve their precious Uchiha, only to return empty-handed and beaten? "The Hokage wants to speak with you first," Nurse Tanaka said, finally looking at him directly. "When you're feeling strong enough." Strong enough. As if strength had ever been his problem. He'd been strong enough to fight Sasuke at the Valley of the End. Strong enough to take a Chidori through the chest. Strong enough to nearly die trying to bring back someone who didn't want to be saved. But not strong enough to succeed. "I'm strong enough now," he said, pushing himself up despite the sharp protest from his ribs. Nurse Tanaka frowned. "Naruto-kun, you should rest." I said I'm fine. The words came out harsher than he intended, and she flinched slightly. Another person afraid of him. Another person who saw the demon before they saw the boy. She left without another word, and Naruto was alone again with the silence and the cracks in the ceiling. That's when he heard it, soft as a whisper, warm as honey, and poisonous as a viper's bite. "They blame you, Kit. They always have." Naruto's eyes widened. The voice was unmistakable, though he'd never heard it speak so gently before. Kurama, the nine-tailed fox, had always been rage and fury and crushing malice. This was different. This was almost understanding. "Kurama," he whispered to the empty room. "Who else would speak truth to you when all others offer lies? You gave everything, your blood, your chakra, your very life, and still they whisper of your failure." Naruto's hands clenched into fists, pulling at the 4-line taped to his arm. "I did fail. Sasuke's gone, and it's my fault." "Your fault." There was amusement in the fox's voice now, dark and bitter. "Tell me, Kit, whose fault was it that the Uchiha was marked by that snake, Orochimaru? Whose fault was it that your sensei taught him techniques that could kill you rather than bonds that could save him? Whose fault was it that this village, your village, allowed him to leave in the first place?" "But I should have..." "Should have what? Died? You tried that. I felt your heart stop on that battlefield. I felt your life slip away while you bled for someone who drove a lightning blade through your chest without hesitation." The voice grew softer, more persuasive. "And what thanks do you receive? Whispers in hallways. Blame in hospital rooms. The weight of everyone else's failures placed squarely on your shoulders." Naruto wanted to argue, wanted to defend his village, his friends, his sensei, but the words stuck in his throat like swallowed glass. Because deep down, in a place he didn't want to acknowledge, Kurama's words rang with a terrible truth. He'd been brought back to the village like a broken tool, patched up in secret, visited by no one except medical staff who could barely look at him. Where was Kakashi-sensei? Where were his friends? Where was anyone who might tell him that it wasn't his fault, that he'd done everything he could? The answer was deafening in its silence. Rest now, kid. Heal your body. But remember, they sent you to bring back their precious Uchiha. And when you couldn't accomplish the impossible, they decided it was easier to blame the demon child than to examine their own failures. The voice faded, leaving Naruto alone with his thoughts and the growing certainty that something fundamental had shifted inside him. The cracks in the ceiling seemed deeper now, more numerous, as if the building itself was reflecting the fractures in his faith. 3 hours later, when Nurse Tanaka returned with his dinner tray, she found him staring out the window at the village below. The setting sun painted everything in shades of red and gold, beautiful and warm, but all Naruto could see were the faces of people who had never wanted him to succeed in the first place. "Your friend stopped by earlier," she said quietly, setting the tray on his bedside table. "Shikamaru and Chuji. They wanted to see you, but visiting hours were over." Naruto didn't respond. Friends. The word felt foreign now, tainted by doubt and Kurama's whispered truths. "They asked me to tell you that everyone made it back safe," she continued. "All the retrieval team members are recovering well. Everyone except Sasuke. Everyone except the one person the mission was meant to save." "That's good," Naruto said, and the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. As night fell over Konoha, Naruto lay awake listening to the sounds of a village settling into peaceful sleep. Somewhere out there, families were gathering for dinner, children were being tucked into bed, and people were living lives unburdened by the weight of impossible expectations and inevitable failure. And somewhere else, much farther away, Sasuke was walking deeper into darkness, following a path that Naruto hadn't been strong enough to pull him from. The failure echoed in his chest like a physical wound, and for the first time since returning to the village, Naruto began to wonder if Kurama might be right. If maybe, just maybe, the problem wasn't his strength or his dedication or his willpower. Maybe the problem was that he'd been fighting for people who had never really wanted him to win. The thought should have horrified him. Instead, as sleep finally claimed him in the small hours of the morning, it felt almost like relief. Chapter 2. The Weight of Expectations. The Hokage's office felt smaller than Naruto remembered, as if the walls had closed in during his 3 days in the hospital. Tsunade sat behind her desk, hands folded, her usual sake nowhere to be seen. That alone told him how serious this conversation was going to be. "Sit," she said without looking up from the mission report spread before her. Naruto remained standing. His ribs still ached with every breath, but he wasn't about to show weakness. Not here. Not when he could already feel the weight of disappointment pressing down on him like a physical thing. "I said sit, Naruto." Tsunade's voice carried the authority of the Hokage, and despite everything, old habits died hard. He dropped in the chair across from her desk, its leather creaking under his weight. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of shuffling papers and the distant noise of the village going about its daily business. Normal people doing normal things, unburdened by the crushing responsibility of being the supposed hero who couldn't even save his best friend. Finally, Tsunade looked up, and Naruto wished she hadn't. Her brown eyes held a mixture of disappointment, frustration, and something that might have been pity. He wasn't sure which one cut deeper. "The mission was a failure," she said without preamble. "Sasuke Uchiha has defected to Orochimaru. 3 team members were critically injured. The enemy escaped with their target." She set the report aside and leaned back in her chair. "Tell me, Naruto, what part of this outcome resembles success?" "We all made it back alive," Naruto said quietly. "That's something, right?" "Is it?" Tsunade's voice was sharp now, cutting. "Because from where I sit, It looks like I sent 5 of our most promising young shinobi on what should have been a simple retrieval mission, and they came back broken and empty-handed. Shikamaru is blaming himself for his tactical failures. Chuji nearly died from those cursed pills. Niji's injuries will take weeks to heal properly. Kiba's been having nightmares about those sound ninja. Each name felt like a weight added to Naruto's shoulders. His friends, his teammates, all hurt because he hadn't been strong enough to stop Sasuke from leaving in the first place. But you, Tsunade continued, her gaze never wavering from his face. You were the one who was supposed to bring him back. You were the one who knew him best, who had the strongest bond with him. You were the one I trusted to succeed where others might fail. Listen to how she speaks to you, kid, as if their failures are your burden to bear. Naruto's hands clenched in his lap. Kurama's voice was becoming a constant presence now, a whispered commentary that made every interaction feel like a test he was doomed to fail. I tried, he said, and hated how small his voice sounded. I gave everything I had. Clearly, it wasn't enough. Tsunade stood and walked to the window, looking out at the village she was sworn to protect. Do you understand the position this puts us in? Sasuke was the last loyal Uchiha. His defection isn't just a personal loss, it's a strategic disaster. His Sharingan, his potential, his bloodline, all of it is now in the hands of our enemies. You think I don't know that? The words burst out of Naruto before he could stop them, louder and harsher than he'd intended. You think I don't replay every second of that fight? You think I don't see his face every time I close my eyes? Tsunade turned back to him, eyebrows raised at his outburst. Then you understand why. Why what? Why everyone looks at me like I personally handed Sasuke over to Orochimaru. Why the medical staff whispers about how the demon boy couldn't even save his best friend. Why you're sitting here lecturing me about responsibility when I'm the only one who actually fought him face to face. The silence that followed was deafening. Tsunade's expression shifted from surprise to something colder, more calculating. That's enough, she said quietly. I understand you're upset. Upset? Naruto laughed, and the sound was bitter and wrong coming from him. I'm not upset, Granny Tsunade. I am tired. I'm tired of being blamed for everyone else's failures. I'm tired of being expected to fix problems I didn't create. And I'm really tired of being treated like a weapon when I succeed and a disappointment when I don't. Yes, kid, let the truth flow. See how quickly her sympathy turns to suspicion when you stop playing the role of the grateful little soldier. Tsunade's eyes narrowed. You're walking a dangerous line, Naruto. That kind of thinking. What kind of thinking? The kind where I actually examine what happened instead of just accepting blame. Naruto stood, his chair scraping against the floor. Sasuke left because he wanted power, because he chose revenge over bonds, because this village couldn't give him what he thought he needed. That's not my failure, that's yours. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. When Tsunade spoke again, her voice carried the full weight of her authority. Sit down. For a moment, Naruto considered refusing. The rebellious part of him, the part that was growing stronger with each of Kurama's whispered encouragements, wanted to walk out of this office and never look back. But years of conditioning won out, and he sank back into his chair. You're right about one thing, Tsunade said, returning to her seat. This village failed Sasuke. We all did. But that doesn't change the fact that you were his teammate, his closest friend, and you couldn't reach him when it mattered most. That failure is yours to carry, just as the larger failure is mine. So what now? Naruto asked. You want me to apologize for not dying hard enough? Promise to do better next time someone I care about decides to abandon everything we've built together? I want you to learn from this, Tsunade replied. I want you to understand that being a shinobi means accepting responsibility for both success and failure. And right now, I want you to go home, rest, and prepare for your next assignment. Which is border patrol, solo missions. Nothing too demanding. She picked up another scroll from her desk. You're clearly not ready for team leadership responsibilities. The words hit him like a physical blow. Solo missions. Away from teams, away from friends, away from anyone who might depend on him. It was exile disguised as duty, punishment wrapped in the language of necessity. Do you see now, kid? In their eyes, you are useful only when you succeed and dangerous when you fail. They speak of responsibility while denying you the chance to prove yourself. They offer punishment disguised as protection. Is that all? Naruto asked, standing again. That's all. Dismissed. He turned to leave, but Tsunade's voice stopped him at the door. Naruto. When he looked back, her expression had softened slightly. I know this is hard, but you're stronger than this. Don't let one failure define you. One failure. As if losing Sasuke was just a single mistake instead of the culmination of everything wrong with his life, his village, and his place in the world. Right, he said. I'll try to remember that. The sun was setting as Naruto walked through the village streets, and everywhere he looked, he saw a celebration. Not literal celebration, no festivals or parties, but the quiet satisfaction of people going about their lives without the weight of impossible expectations crushing them into the ground. He passed Ichiraku Ramen, where Tucci waved at him through the window. The gesture was friendly enough, but Naruto caught the worry in the old man's eyes, the way he glanced around to see who might be watching him acknowledge the demon container. He passed the training grounds where he'd spent countless hours with Team 7, learning to work together, building bonds that were supposed to last forever. A group of academy students was practicing there now, their instructor calling out corrections and encouragement. When they noticed Naruto, their voices dropped to whispers. Is that him? The one who couldn't bring back the Uchiha? My dad says he's dangerous. Their instructor quickly herded them away, shooting Naruto an apologetic look that somehow made everything worse. Even the children knew he was a failure. By the time he reached his apartment, the sun had fully set, and Naruto felt hollow inside. Empty, as if something essential had been carved out of him during that meeting with Tsunade. He didn't turn on the lights. Instead, he sat on his bed in the darkness, staring at the photographs scattered across his dresser. Pictures of Team 7 during happier times. Pictures of him and Sasuke sparring, arguing, learning to be a team. Pictures of a friendship that had meant everything to him and apparently nothing to the person it was supposed to bind. Look at those images, kid. Look at how happy you were, how trusting. And where did that trust lead you? Shut up, Naruto whispered, but there was no heat in it. You gave everything for them, and what did you receive? Scorn, blame, exiges guised a solo missions. They'll use you when they need a weapon and discard you when you prove inconveniently human. They're not like that. Aren't they? Tell me, when was the last time someone thanked you for what you sacrificed? When was the last time someone asked how you were handling Sasuke's betrayal instead of demanding to know why you failed to prevent it? Naruto couldn't answer because there was no answer. No one had asked how he was doing. No one had acknowledged that losing Sasuke was his loss too, his grief too, his heart breaking alongside everyone else's. They expect you to be their perfect soldier, unbreaking, unquestioning, always ready to bleed for their cause. But the moment you show weakness, the moment you fail to meet their impossible standards, you become the problem to be managed rather than the person to be supported. Without thinking, Naruto found himself standing, moving to his closet. He pulled out his gear, kunai, shuriken, his headband. If Tsunade wanted him to train alone, he'd train alone. He'd push himself until his body gave out, until the physical exhaustion drowned out the voice in his head that was making too much sense. The training ground he chose was isolated, far from the main areas where other ninja practiced. He discovered it months ago during one of his solo training sessions, a small clearing surrounded by dense trees that muffled sound and hid him from curious eyes. Perfect for someone who was no longer welcome in the spaces where real teams train together. He started with basic kata, working through forms that Kakashi had taught him. But every movement reminded him of lessons shared with Sasuke, of competitions and camaraderie, and the easy friendship that had made everything else bearable. Soon, basic forms weren't enough. He moved to jutsu practice, pushing chakra through techniques with more force than necessary, letting the burn of overexertion replace the ache in his chest. Shadow clone jutsu, Rasengan, every technique in his arsenal, practiced with increasing desperation as the night wore on. Sweat soaked through his clothes, his muscles screamed in protest, and still he pushed harder. Yes, kid, feed that anger. Let it burn away the weakness they've tried to instill in you. You are powerful, more powerful than any of them realize. Why should you limit yourself for their comfort? Hours passed. The moon climbed high overhead, and still Naruto trained, his movements becoming sloppy with exhaustion, but never stopping. He couldn't stop. If he stopped, he'd have to think about Tsunade's disappointment, about his friend's injuries, about Sasuke's face as he walked away into darkness. If he stopped, he'd have to acknowledge that everything he believed about bonds and friendship and belonging might be nothing more than comforting lies he'd told himself to make the loneliness bearable. Dawn was breaking when he finally collapsed, falling to his knees in the churned-up dirt of the training ground. His vision blurred with exhaustion, his lungs burning, his entire body shaking from overexertion. But the voice in his head was clearer than ever. Look at you, kid. Magnificent in your strength, terrible in your dedication. And they want to waste you on solo missions and border patrols. They want to hide your light under a bushel because it threatens their small, ordered world. Naruto pressed his forehead to the ground, tasting dirt and sweat and the bitter flavor of growing disillusion. You gave everything for them, and what did you receive? Scorn. This time, he didn't argue. Chapter 3, Kakashi's Burden. Kakashi Itachi had never considered himself a particularly good teacher. This wasn't false modesty or self-deprecation. It was a cold assessment of facts. Good teachers inspired their students, guided them toward growth, and helped them navigate the complexities of both technique and philosophy. Good teachers built bonds that lasted beyond the classroom. Kakashi had failed to save either of his students. He stood on the roof of his apartment building in the pre-dawn darkness, looking out over the village he'd sworn to protect. Somewhere in those winding streets, Naruto was probably still training himself to exhaustion. The boy had been doing it every night since his release from the hospital, pushing his body past reasonable limits in isolated training grounds where he thought no one would notice. Kakashi noticed. He'd been watching from the shadows, too much of a coward to approach directly, too consumed by guilt to know what he'd say if he did. I failed you both, he thought, and the words felt like glass in his throat. I taught Sasuke techniques that made him more dangerous without teaching him the wisdom to use them responsibly. I focused on your natural talent, Naruto, without addressing the emotional wounds that made you so desperate for acknowledgement. The worst part was the timing. If he'd intervened earlier, if he'd recognized the signs of Sasuke's growing darkness, if he'd been the teacher they'd needed instead of the distant mentor he'd chosen to be. But if was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not when one student was walking deeper into Orochimaru's web with every passing day, and the other was slowly drowning in a village that expected him to be their perfect weapon without offering him the support he needed to maintain his humanity. A soft knock at his door interrupted his brooding. Kakashi wasn't expecting visitors. Few people knew where he lived, and fewer still would visit at this hour. He dropped silently from the roof to his apartment, landing on the balcony and slipping through the sliding door. Another knock, more insistent this time. Kakashi-sensei. The voice was muffled but unmistakable. Naruto. For a moment, Kakashi hesitated. He'd been trying to work up the courage to approach his remaining student for days, but now that Naruto had come to him, he felt completely unprepared. What did you say to someone you'd failed so completely? How did you begin to bridge a gap that felt like an ocean? He opened the door. Naruto looked terrible. His clothes were stained with dirt and sweat. His hair was a mess, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too little sleep and too much self-punishment. But it was his expression that made Kakashi's chest tighten. Gone was the bright enthusiasm that had defined the boy since the day they'd met. In its place was something harder, more guarded, as if he'd built walls where there used to be open doors. "Naruto," Kakashi said, stepping aside to let him in. "This is unexpected." "Yeah, well." Naruto entered the apartment, but didn't sit, standing near the door as if ready to bolt at any moment. "I wanted to ask you something." "Of course. What is it?" Naruto was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally looked up, his blue eyes held an intensity that was unsettling in someone so young. "Why didn't you teach me the Chidori?" The question hit Kakashi like a physical blow. He'd been expecting anger about the mission's failure, or questions about what they should do next, or even accusations about his shortcomings as a teacher. He hadn't expected this. "Naruto, you taught it to Sasuke. You spent weeks working with him, perfecting his technique, making him stronger. But you never offered to teach it to me." Naruto's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that made Kakashi's instincts prickle. Was it because I wasn't good enough? Because I didn't have a Sharingan to copy it perfectly? "It wasn't about worthiness," Kakashi said carefully. "The Chidori requires speed, precision, the ability to see your opponent's movements clearly." Naruto nodded. "I know. Sasuke explained it to me right before he tried to put it through my chest." The casual way he said it, as if discussing the weather rather than a near-death experience, was more disturbing than any emotional outburst would have been. "The technique wasn't right for your fighting style," Kakashi explained, though the words felt inadequate. "Your strength has always been in your unpredictability, your chakra reserves, your ability to outlast opponents through sheer determination. The Chidori is a precision weapon. A precision weapon that you gave to someone who was already walking away from us," Naruto interrupted. "Tell me, Kakashi-sensei, when you were teaching Sasuke to kill with lightning, did you ever think about what would happen if he decided we were his enemies?" The question hung in the air between them like an accusation. Because the horrible truth was that Kakashi had thought about it, in the dark corners of his mind that he tried not to examine too closely. He'd seen the signs of Sasuke's growing isolation, his increasing obsession with power, his willingness to harm teammates in pursuit of his goals. And he'd chosen to ignore those signs in favor of focusing on technique and strength. "I thought I could reach him," Kakashi said quietly. "I thought that by helping him become stronger, I could give him the tools to overcome his darkness." "And what about me?" Naruto asked. "What tools did you give me to overcome mine?" "You don't have darkness, Naruto. You're—" "Don't." The word came out sharp enough to cut. "Don't you dare tell me I don't have darkness. I have a demon sealed inside me that whispers about power and revenge every time I close my eyes. I have a village that sees me as a weapon first and a person second. I have teammates who blame me for their failures and a sensei." He stopped himself, but the damage was already done. "A sensei who what?" Kakashi asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Naruto was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was almost too soft to hear. "A sensei who taught his star pupil how to kill, but never taught his problem student how to live." The words hit harder than any jutsu Kakashi had ever faced. He opened his mouth to argue, to defend himself, to explain that it wasn't that simple, but the explanations died in his throat because maybe it really was that simple. He'd spent months teaching Sasuke advanced techniques, while leaving Naruto to figure out basic chakra control on his own. He'd focused on Sasuke's tactical development, while dismissing Naruto's emotional needs as something the boy would eventually grow out of. He'd poured his energy into saving the student who seemed destined for greatness, while taking for granted the one who seemed too resilient to break. "Do you see now, kid? Even he cannot deny the truth of what you've observed." Naruto's hand went to his stomach for a moment, and something flickered across his expression, surprise, maybe a recognition. But it was gone so quickly that Kakashi almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. Naruto, he said, reaching out tentatively. I know I've made mistakes. Mistakes? Naruto laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want to call it mistakes? Fine, let's talk about mistakes. Your mistake was treating us like we were both destined for the same path when we clearly needed different things. Your mistake was prioritizing power over people. Your mistake was assuming that natural talent was more important than emotional stability. Each word was precise, calculated, nothing like the rambling speeches Naruto was known for. It was as if someone else was speaking through him, someone older, more cynical, more aware of the world's fundamental unfairness. But the biggest mistake, Naruto continued, was thinking that you could fix everything with technique and training. Some problems can't be solved with more jutsu, Kakashi-sensei. Some problems require actually caring about the person, not just the soldier. I do care about you, Kakashi said, and the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Both of you. Everything I did was because I cared. Really? Then why did you never ask me how I was handling the villagers' hatred? Why did you never check to see if I was okay after missions where I had to use the Nine-Tails chakra? Why did you never once acknowledge that being a Jinchuriki might come with challenges that had nothing to do with combat effectiveness? Kakashi opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Because Naruto was right. He treated the Nine-Tails as a resource to be managed rather than a burden to be understood. He focused on helping Naruto control the fox's power without ever considering what it might cost him emotionally. I'm sorry, he said finally, and the words felt pathetically inadequate. Naruto studied him for a moment, and there was something in his expression that Kakashi had never seen before. Pity, maybe, or disappointment so deep it had calcified into indifference. Yeah, Naruto said quietly. I figured you would be. He turned to leave, but Kakashi caught his arm. Wait, let me make this right. Let me be the teacher you needed. It's too late for that. Naruto pulled free gently, not with anger, but with the calm certainty of someone who had already made their peace with disappointment. You can't undo years of neglect with good intentions, and you can't fix fundamental problems with last-minute attention. Then what do you want from me? Naruto paused at the door, his hand on the handle. I want you to leave me alone, he said without turning around. I want you to stop following me to training grounds and watching me from rooftops like I'm some kind of flight risk. I want you to accept that maybe, just maybe, the problem isn't that your students were broken. Maybe the problem is that you never bothered to learn how to fix what was wrong with them. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Kakashi alone with his guilt and the growing certainty that he'd just lost his second student in as many weeks. From his position on a rooftop 3 buildings away, a figure in a dark cloak observed the blonde boy's departure from the Hitaki residence. The conversation had been too distant to overhear, but body language spoke volumes. The tension, the obvious conflict, the way the boy had left without the reconciliation his teacher had clearly been hoping for. Interesting. The figure made a few quick hand signs, and a raven materialized from shadows. A brief message was attached to its leg. Just a few words, but enough to convey the essential information. Subject shows increasing isolation from support structure. Emotional bonds weakening. Recommend continued observation. The raven took flight, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness with its report. Soon, it would reach its destination, and the message would be passed up the chain of command to those who understood the value of a powerful young shinobi with nowhere else to turn. But that was for others to decide. For now, the observer simply watched as Naruto Uzumaki walked alone through empty streets, his shoulders set in a line that spoke of resolve rather than defeat. The boy was changing. The question was whether that change would serve their purposes or require intervention. Either way, he would be watched. The child of prophecy was too valuable to lose to the whims of village politics and failed mentorship. Far too valuable. Back in his apartment, Kakashi stood at his window and watched Naruto disappear into the maze of Konoha streets. The boy moved differently now, more purposefully, with less of the bouncing energy that had once made him impossible to ignore. Even his posture had changed, becoming more closed off, more defensive. More like someone who expected the world to disappoint him. I did this, Kakashi thought, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. I broke him as surely as if I'd used a jutsu designed for that purpose. The worst part was that he could see the path forward from here. Naruto would continue to isolate himself, pushing away anyone who tried to help. He'd throw himself into training with increasing desperation, seeking in physical exhaustion what he could no longer find in human connection. He'd grow stronger, yes, but also colder, more bitter, more likely to make the same mistakes that had claimed so many promising shinobi before him. And Kakashi, paralyzed by guilt and uncertainty, would watch it happen while telling himself there was nothing he could do to stop it. Just like he'd watched Sasuke walk away. Just like he'd failed his own sensei all those years ago. Some patterns, it seemed, were destined to repeat themselves no matter how much you wanted to break free. Outside, the sun was rising over Konoha, painting the buildings in shades of gold and orange that should have been beautiful. Instead, all Kakashi could see was the shadow his failure had cast across his student's future, a shadow that was growing longer and darker with each passing day. And somewhere in that shadow, he was certain something was waiting to take advantage of a lonely boy's pain. Chapter 4: The Village That Forgot. The mission was supposed to be simple. Escort a merchant caravan to a border town, ensure their safety, collect payment, return home. Standard C-rank work that barely required a genin, let alone someone with Naruto's capabilities. But Tsunade had been clear, solo missions only, nothing too demanding, prove you can handle responsibility on a smaller scale before being trusted with anything important. It was punishment disguised as duty, and they both knew it. Naruto crouched on a tree branch overlooking the winding mountain road, watching the caravan make its slow progress toward their destination. 3 wagons loaded with goods, a dozen civilians including women and children, and exactly 1 ninja for protection. Him. The merchant leader, Yamamoto, had made his displeasure clear from the moment he'd seen Naruto at the village gates. "This is who they send us? A boy." The man's weathered face had twisted with disgust. "We requested proper protection, not some academy student playing ninja." "I'm qualified for C-rank missions," Naruto had replied, keeping his voice level despite the familiar sting of dismissal. "Qualified?" Yamamoto had looked him up and down with obvious skepticism. "You look like you should be in school, not protecting valuable cargo." If only that had been the worst of it. Now, 3 days into their journey, Naruto had proven his worth multiple times. He'd scared off a pack of wolves with a simple show of chakra. He detected and disabled 3 separate bandit ambushes before they could materialize into real threats. He'd even used his shadow clones to help repair a broken wagon wheel, turning what could have been a day-long delay into a mere hour's inconvenience. And still, the whispers followed him. "Do you hear them, Kit? Even now, when you've proven your value beyond question, they speak of you as if you were the threat rather than their salvation." Kurama's voice had become a constant presence, offering commentary on every interaction, every sideways glance, every hushed conversation that stopped when he drew near. The fox was right, of course. Despite everything he'd done to protect them, the caravan members still watched him with barely concealed fear and suspicion. Movement in the forest caught his attention. Naruto's eyes narrowed as he spotted figures moving through the trees parallel to the road. Too many to be animals, too coordinated to be random travelers. His hand went to his kunai pouch as he counted them. 8, maybe 9 bandits, positioning themselves for an ambush at the narrow pass ahead. This was different from the previous attempts. Those had been opportunistic attacks by small groups hoping for easy prey. This looked organized, planned, with enough numbers to pose a real threat to the caravan. Naruto dropped silently from his perch and made his way back to the wagons. The lead merchant was riding at the front, occasionally barking orders at the drivers or complaining about the pace. Yamamoto-san, Naruto called softly, falling in a step beside the man's horse. We have a problem. The merchant's face soured at the sound of Naruto's voice. What now, boy? More of your paranoid fantasies about bandits in every shadow. There are at least 8 hostiles positioned for an ambush in the pass ahead. I need you to halt the caravan while I deal with them. Deal with them? Yamamoto snorted. You're one child against 8 grown men. Even if your ridiculous story is true, what exactly do you plan to do? Naruto felt his patience fraying. My job, just keep everyone here until I give the all clear. He turned to leave, but Yamamoto's voice stopped him. Wait, if there really are bandits ahead, shouldn't we turn back? Find another route. This is the only viable path to your destination, and turning back would add 3 days to the journey. I can handle 8 bandits. You're insane if you think. I'm a ninja, Naruto said flatly. This is what I do. The ambush site was perfectly chosen, a narrow canyon with steep walls on both sides, limiting escape routes and forcing travelers into a killing field. The bandits had positioned themselves well, with archers on the high ground and spearmen blocking the road ahead. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a death trap for any caravan. Unfortunately for them, Naruto was anything but normal circumstances. He studied their positions from concealment, counting weapons, and assessing threat levels. These weren't desperate thieves looking for a quick score. They were organized, well-equipped, and clearly experienced in this type of operation. Their leader, a scarred man with a massive two-handed sword, was barking quiet orders to his subordinates with the authority of someone accustomed to command. Professional bandits. Probably the remnants of a disbanded mercenary unit or missing nin who turned to highway robbery when more legitimate work dried up. Which meant they were dangerous enough to kill civilians without hesitation, but not quite skilled enough to pose a serious threat to a Konoha ninja. Crush them, kid. Show them what real power looks like. Make them regret the day they decided to prey on those under your protection. Naruto made the hand sign for Shadow Clone Jutsu, creating a dozen copies of himself. The clones scattered to different positions around the canyon, moving with the silent efficiency he developed through years of solo training. The attack came from all sides at once. The first bandit died without ever seeing what killed him, a kunai to the throat from a clone that materialized behind his position. The second managed a scream before another clone's Rasengan turned his chest into a crater. The archers on the canyon walls found themselves under assault from multiple angles as clones bounded up the stone faces with chakra-enhanced speed. It was over in less than 3 minutes. When the dust settled, 8 bodies lay scattered across the canyon floor. The leader, the scarred man with the two-handed sword, was still alive, but only barely. Naruto had deliberately held back the killing blow, leaving him pinned to a tree with kunai through both shoulders. Please, the man gasped, blood running down his chin. We weren't going to kill anyone. Just rob them and let them go. Naruto studied him dispassionately. You had poison on your arrowheads. Killing blades, not sleeping darts. Don't lie to me. The bandit's eyes widened in surprise, then fear. How did you? I can smell it. It was true. One of the many benefits of his connection to Kurama was enhanced senses that made such deceptions obvious. You were planning to murder every person in that caravan, probably after taking whatever you wanted from them first. We were desperate. Times have been hard. Times are hard for everyone. Naruto pulled out another kunai, testing its weight. That doesn't give you the right to prey on innocent people. Wait, I can give you information. Other bandit groups, hidden caches of stolen goods, anything you want. Naruto considered this for a moment, then shook his head. The only thing I want is for people like you to stop making the world more dangerous for everyone else. The final kunai took the bandit leader in the heart, ending his pleas mid-sentence. Efficient. Ruthless. This is what strength looks like, kid. Not the bumbling heroics they taught you in that academy, but the practical application of power in service of a goal. Naruto looked around at the carnage he'd created. 8 bodies scattered like broken dolls, blood pooling in the dust, the scent of death hanging heavy in the air. A year ago, the sight would have made him sick. Now, he felt nothing but grim satisfaction. They'd threatened innocent people. They'd chosen to be predators. This was what happened to predators when they encountered something higher up the food chain. The caravan's reaction when he returned was everything he'd expected and nothing he'd hoped for. "Dear gods," whispered one of the merchants, staring at the blood spattered across Naruto's clothes. "What did you do?" "Dealt with the bandits," Naruto replied simply. "The past is clear now. You killed them." This from Yamamoto, his face pale with shock. "They were going to kill you. All of you." Naruto gestured toward the canyon ahead. Poisoned weapons, planned execution, robbery as an afterthought. This was the only way to ensure your safety. But you're just a boy," stammered one of the women. "How could you—" "Listen to them, kid. You saved their lives, protected their families, eliminated a threat that would have plagued other travelers for months or years to come. And their reaction is horror that you were capable of doing what needed to be done." Naruto watched their faces, the fear, the revulsion, the way they unconsciously stepped back from him as if he were the dangerous one. These people, whose lives he'd just saved, were looking at him like he was a monster. Maybe he was. "The road ahead is safe," he said quietly. "We can reach the border town by evening if we don't delay." The remainder of the journey passed in uncomfortable silence. The merchants and their families spoke in hushed whispers when they thought he wasn't listening, and the children who had been friendly during the early days of travel now hid behind their parents whenever he approached. "Did you see how easily he killed them? 8 men, and he didn't even get hurt. What kind of training produces that sort of efficiency? I heard he has a demon inside him. Maybe that explains." "Sure, he might hear you." By the time they reached their destination, Naruto felt like a plague carrier escorting a group of terrified refugees. The border town's gates were a welcome sight, not because they marked the completion of his mission, but because they represented the end of his current torment. The mission payment was completed in uncomfortable silence. Yamamoto handed over the agreed-upon fee without meeting Naruto's eyes, as if afraid that direct eye contact might somehow contaminate him. "Thank you for your service," the merchant said stiffly. "I'll be sure to mention your effectiveness in my report to the Hokage." Effectiveness, not heroism, not protection, not going above and beyond to ensure their safety. Effectiveness, as if he were a particularly sharp tool rather than a person who'd risked his life for their benefit. "Do you see now, kid? They will never accept you. You are their weapon, not their hero. No matter how many lives you save, how many threats you eliminate, how much you sacrifice for their sake, you will always be the monster they tolerate rather than the guardian they celebrate." As Naruto began the long journey back to Konoha alone, Kurama's words echoed in his mind with the weight of undeniable truth. He'd completed a perfect mission. No civilian casualties, threat eliminated, objectives achieved. And his reward was to be treated like a dangerous animal that had performed its trick adequately. The sun was setting when he stopped at a roadside inn for the night. The innkeeper, an elderly woman with kind eyes, took one look at his blood-stained clothes and the hollowness in his expression and offered him a room without questions. It was the first genuine kindness he'd encountered in days. "Rough mission?" she asked as she led him upstairs. "Something like that." "Well, you're safe here. Hot meal, clean bed, and no one will bother you with questions you don't want to answer." Her simple acceptance, the way she treated him as just another tired traveler rather than a potential threat, almost broke something inside him. This stranger showed him more consideration in 5 minutes than the people he'd risked his life to protect had managed in an entire week. That night, as he lay in a bed that smelled of lavender and listened to the sound of normal people living normal lives in the rooms around him, Naruto made a decision that would have terrified him a month earlier. He stopped caring what they thought of him. If they wanted to see him as a weapon rather than a person, fine. If they wanted to fear his effectiveness while benefiting from his protection, so be it. If they could only accept his service while rejecting his humanity, then perhaps it was time to stop offering his humanity for their consideration. Wisdom at last, Kit. You're learning what I learned long ago. The only relationship that matters is the one between predator and prey. Everything else is just pretty words meant to disguise the fundamental truth of power. For the first time since the fox had started speaking to him, Naruto didn't argue with its assessment. Unknown to Naruto, his mentor Jiraiya had arrived in Konoha that very evening, having completed a particularly grueling intelligence-gathering mission on the borders of Rain Country. The Toad Sage was tired, dirty, and looking forward to a hot bath and a bottle of sake, roughly in that order. He was also completely unaware of his student's growing crisis. Jiraiya-sama. Tsunade's assistant appeared at his elbow almost before he'd cleared the village gates. The Hokage requests your immediate presence. She says it's urgent. Jiraiya suppressed a groan. Urgent usually meant either a new threat to the village's security or political complications that required his particular skill set to navigate. Either way, it meant his bath and sake would have to wait. What's the situation? He asked as they made their way through the village streets. Intelligence reports from our border stations. Increased Akatsuki activity, possible movements against other Jinchuriki villages. The Hokage wants your assessment of the threat level. Akatsuki. Jiraiya's expression darkened. He'd been tracking the organization's movements for months, trying to understand their ultimate goals and capabilities, if they were accelerating their timeline. Any word on specific targets? Preliminary reports suggest they may be moving against the Sand Village next. The one-tail Jinchuriki. Gaara. Jiraiya picked up the pace. If Akatsuki was targeting Gaara, it meant they were moving into the active phase of their plan, which meant Naruto would be a target soon enough if he wasn't already. His mind was so focused on the larger strategic implications that he completely missed the smaller crisis playing out in his student's heart. The reports of solo missions and isolation, the concerned whispers from hospital staff, the way certain merchants had described their ninja escort as effective but disturbing, all of it passed by his awareness like background noise. After all, Naruto was strong. Naruto was resilient. Naruto could handle a few difficult missions while the adults dealt with the real threats. It was exactly the kind of assumption that had already cost Konoha one promising student. And as the night deepened around the village, with Jiraiya locked in strategic planning sessions and Naruto lying awake in a roadside and questioning everything he'd ever believed about heroism and sacrifice, the distance between teacher and student grew just a little bit wider. Just wide enough for something else to slip through the gap. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Dark. Sleep, when it finally came, brought no peace. Naruto found himself standing in a place that felt familiar yet wrong. The streets of Konoha, but empty of people and draped in perpetual twilight. The buildings were the right shape, the roads followed the correct paths, but everything was rendered in shades of gray and shadow, as if the color had been drained from the world. He walked through the deserted village, his footsteps echoing strangely in the silence. No shopkeepers calling out their wares, no children playing in the streets, no ninja leaping across rooftops on their way to missions. Just emptiness stretching in every direction. Lonely, isn't it? Naruto spun toward the voice, his hand instinctively reaching for a kunai that wasn't there. Standing beneath a flickering streetlight was a figure in a black cloak marked with red clouds. Tall, pale, with long dark hair framing features that were both beautiful and terrible. Itachi Uchiha. You. Naruto breathed, his heart racing. What are you doing here? This is a dream, Itachi said calmly, stepping forward into the light. His red Sharingan eyes seemed to glow in the gray twilight. Your dream, to be precise. I am merely visiting. Naruto tensed, preparing to fight, but something fell off. His chakra felt sluggish, distant, as if he were trying to access it through thick glass. Even his body felt strange, present but not quite real, like a reflection in water. The fox's voice, when it came, was oddly subdued. Interesting. The Uchiha has skill, I'll give him that. What do you want? Naruto demanded, though his voice sounded hollow in the empty air. To talk. Itachi's expression was unreadable, neither threatening nor reassuring. Nothing more. In dreams, we can speak without the complications of the waking world. No villages to defend, no loyalties to consider, no expectations to meet. I'm not telling you anything about Konoha's defenses. I'm not asking about them. Itachi began walking, his movements fluid and unhurried. Tell me, Naruto Uzumaki, when did you last feel truly welcomed in your village? The question hit harder than any physical attack could have. Naruto found himself walking alongside the missing Nin, though he couldn't remember deciding to do so. It's not like that, he said, but the words felt weak even to his own ears. Isn't it? Itachi glanced at him sideways. When you return from missions, do they celebrate your success or simply expect it? When you're injured in service to the village, do they tend to your wounds with gratitude or clinical detachment? When you save their lives, do they thank you or fear what you might do next? Each question was a knife twisted in an already bleeding wound. Because the terrible truth was that Naruto couldn't remember the last time someone had genuinely thanked him for his service, the last time his success had been celebrated rather than simply acknowledged as expected, the last time anyone had looked at him with gratitude instead of wariness. They're just scared, Naruto said weakly. The Nine Tails. The Nine Tails is part of you, not the whole of you. Itachi stopped walking and turned to face him directly. But they choose to see only the fox, don't they? The weapon they can deploy when convenient. The threat they must tolerate when not. He speaks truth, Kit. More truth than your so-called friends have offered in years. Kurama's voice held an odd note of approval. Listen to what he says. There is wisdom in his words. Why are you telling me this? Naruto asked. What's in it for you? Perhaps I simply recognize a kindred spirit. Itachi resumed walking, leading them toward what looked like the academy building. Do you know what it's like to be branded a traitor by people who never understood your true loyalty? To have your every action interpreted through the lens of their fear rather than your intent. You murdered your entire clan, Naruto said, but there was less heat in the accusation than there should have been. Did I? Itachi's smile was enigmatic, neither confirming nor denying. Or did I do what was necessary to prevent a greater tragedy? The difference between those two interpretations often comes down to perspective and whose version of events you choose to believe. They had reached the academy now, its familiar facade rendered strange and ominous in the dreamlight. Itachi gestured toward the building where Naruto had spent some of his most painful early years. Tell me about this place, he said. What do you remember most clearly? Without thinking, Naruto found himself answering. Being alone, sitting by myself, while everyone else had friends to talk to, groups to belong to. The teachers who looked at me like I was a problem to be managed rather than a student to be taught. And how did that make you feel? Angry. Sad. Like I was broken somehow, like there was something fundamentally wrong with me that everyone else could see, but I couldn't understand. Itachi nodded as if this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. And now, years later, with all your strength and accomplishments, how do people look at you? The answer came without conscious thought, the same way. Yes. Itachi's voice was almost gentle now, because they never saw you as a person to begin with. You were always just a repository for their fears and expectations. A convenient solution to their problems when you succeeded, a dangerous liability when you failed. He understands, Kit. He sees what I've been trying to show you, that their acceptance was never real, their bonds were never true. They used you. But that's not. Naruto struggled to find words to refute what felt increasingly like truth. There are people who care about me. My teammates, my sensei. Your teammates who blame you for Sasuke's defection? Your sensei who taught your rival deadly techniques, while leaving you to develop your own skills through trial and error. Itachi's questions were surgical in their precision. Tell me, when Sasuke chose to leave the village, who was held responsible? When the mission to retrieve him failed, who bore the burden of that failure? The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications Naruto didn't want to examine. You carry the weight of everyone else's shortcomings, Itachi continued. Their failures become your failures. Their fears become your isolation. Their limitations become your cage. They were walking through the academy halls now, past empty classrooms and silent corridors. In one room, Naruto could see ghostly images of his younger self, alone at a desk, ignored by teachers, mocked by classmates. I used to think things would get better, he said quietly, not sure why he was sharing this with someone who should be his enemy. I thought if I just got stronger, if I proved myself enough times, eventually they'd see me differently. And have they? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Because the honest answer, the answer Naruto had been trying not to think about for weeks, was no. If anything, his growing strength seemed to make people more afraid of him, not less. Strength without acceptance is just another form of imprisonment, Itachi observed. They keep you close enough to use your power, but far enough away to avoid confronting their own hypocrisy. Listen to him, kid. He speaks of realities that your village mentors would never acknowledge. There is liberation in truth, even painful truth. What are you suggesting? Naruto asked, though part of him already knew. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm simply observing that you have choices they would prefer you never realize you possess. Itachi stopped beside a window that looked out over the dream version of Konoha. You could leave. You could find people who value strength over sentiment, results over rhetoric. You could discover what it means to be appreciated for what you are rather than tolerated for what you represent. Leave Konoha? The idea should have been unthinkable, but it wasn't. Over the past weeks, the thought had crossed his mind more than once, usually in the dark hours after particularly painful encounters with the village's judgment. Why not? What has your loyalty earned you? What has your sacrifice accomplished? What has your dedication brought you besides more expectations and greater isolation? Each question was a blow to foundations that were already cracking. Because when Naruto tried to think of reasons to stay, to continue fighting for people who seemed determined to see him as a weapon rather than a person, the list felt disturbingly short. There are people who need me, he said, but the words lacked conviction. Are there? Or are there people who need your power while remaining fundamentally uninterested in your well-being? Itachi turned from the window to look at him directly. The distinction matters. Naruto. One relationship is based on mutual respect. The other is simply exploitation dressed in prettier language. The dream village around them began to shift and blur, as if their conversation was reaching its natural conclusion. But Itachi's words remained crystal clear, each one etching itself into Naruto's consciousness with the weight of revelation. Think carefully about what you truly owe to people who have never truly accepted you, the Uchiha said, his form beginning to fade. And remember, there are others in this world who understand what it means to be cast aside by those who should have protected you. Others who value strength and loyalty over politics and fear. Wait, Naruto called out as the dream dissolved around them. What do you mean? Who are you talking about? But Itachi was already gone, and the gray twilight was giving way to deeper darkness. Interesting visitor, Kit. Very interesting indeed. You knew he was here? Naruto's mental voice was sharp with accusation. Why didn't you warn me? Warn you? Why would I warn you away from someone speaking sense for the first time in months? His words carry truth, even if his motives remain unclear. He's a criminal, a missing mean. So is I in their eyes. So are all those who refuse to bow to the arbitrary authority of village elders and political structures. Perhaps the question isn't why someone like him would reach out to you, but why it took so long for anyone to do so. The fox's words followed Naruto into true sleep, where dreams gave way to deeper rest, but no real peace. He woke in his roadside inn room with the taste of revelation bitter on his tongue. Dawn light was creeping through the shuttered windows, painting everything in shades of gold that seemed too bright, too cheerful for the darkness that had taken root in his thoughts. The dream felt more real than the waking world, more honest, more direct, more willing to confront truths that everyone else seemed determined to ignore. Itachi's questions echoed in his mind with the persistence of actual memories, each one forcing him to examine assumptions he'd never thought to question. What has your loyalty earned you? What has your sacrifice accomplished? What has your dedication brought you besides more expectations and greater isolation? Naruto sat on the edge of the narrow bed, his head in his hands, and tried to find answers that didn't sound hollow. He thought of all the missions completed, all the threats eliminated, all the people saved. But when he tried to balance that against gratitude received, genuine acceptance earned, or authentic friendships forged, the scales tipped in a direction that made his chest tight with something dangerously close to despair. Had it always been this one-sided? Or was he only now seeing clearly for the first time? The innkeeper knocked softly on his door, interrupting his brooding. "Breakfast is ready if you'd like some, young man. No charge. You look like you could use a good meal." Her kindness was genuine, uncomplicated by fear or expectation. She wanted nothing from him except perhaps his company at her table, and even that was offered freely rather than demanded. It was the sort of simple human consideration that should have been commonplace but felt precious in its rarity. "Thank you," he called back. "I'll be down in a moment." As he gathered his gear and prepared to continue his journey back to Konoha, Naruto caught sight of his reflection in the room's small mirror. The face looking back at him was older than it should have been, marked by experiences that had aged him beyond his years. But it was the eyes that gave him pause, still blue, still bright, but holding a wariness that hadn't been there before. The eyes of someone who was learning not to trust too easily, not to hope too freely, not to give too much of themselves to people who might not value what they received. Change is natural, Kit. Growth requires the shedding of old illusions and the acceptance of harder truths. The boy who left on this mission is not the same as the one who will return. For once, Naruto didn't argue with the fox's observation, because it was true. Something fundamental had shifted inside him over the past few weeks. The unshakable faith in his village, his friends, his place in the world had developed cracks that were spreading with each new disappointment. And maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Maybe it was time to stop defining himself by other people's expectations and start considering what he actually wanted from his life. Maybe it was time to stop accepting crumbs of acknowledgement as if they were feast and start demanding the respect his achievements had earned. Maybe it was time to consider that there might be other paths to the peace and belonging he'd always sought, paths that didn't require him to constantly prove his worth to people who seemed determined to withhold their acceptance no matter what he accomplished. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, as he made his way downstairs to share breakfast with a kind stranger who asked nothing of him except his company, it felt almost like freedom. Chapter 6: The Prophecy's Shadow. Naruto had been back in Konoha for exactly 4 hours when Jiraiya found him. He was sitting on the swings of the old academy playground, the same swings where he'd spent countless lonely afternoons as a child, watching other kids laugh and play while he remained on the periphery. The irony wasn't lost on him. Even as a teenager who'd saved the village multiple times, he still ended up in the same place, still on the outside looking in. "There you are." Jiraiya's voice boomed across the empty playground. "I've been looking everywhere for you, kid." Naruto didn't turn around, didn't get up from the swing, didn't show any of the enthusiasm that usually accompanied his mentor's arrival. He just sat there, gently rocking back and forth, watching the sun set through the tree branches. "Hey," Jiraiya said again, his tone shifting from boisterous to concerned as he approached. "Rough mission. Completed successfully," Naruto replied without inflection. Objective achieved, civilians protected, hostiles eliminated. The merchants will reach their destination safely and with all their goods intact. The clinical way he reported it made Jiraiya pause. This wasn't how Naruto usually described his missions. There were no animated gestures, no excited rambling about techniques he'd used or people he'd helped. Just facts, delivered with the emotional investment of someone reading a weather report. That's good, Jiraiya said carefully, settling onto the swing beside his student. But I wasn't asking about the mission results. I was asking how you're doing. I'm fine. The words came out flat, automatic, the kind of response that ended conversations rather than encouraged them. Jiraiya studied his student's profile in the dying light. Naruto looked older somehow, as if the few days away had aged him months. There was a set to his shoulders, a hardness around his eyes, that spoke of experiences that had cut deeper than simple physical challenges. Tsunade told me about what happened with Sasuke, Jiraiya said quietly. About the mission, the failure. I know that must be eating at you. Here it comes, kid. Another adult ready to tell you how to feel about your pain, how to process your loss, how to be the person they need you to be rather than the person you are. Naruto's grip tightened on the swing's chains. Do you? Do you really know? I know what it's like to lose someone important, to feel responsible for their choices. Jiraiya's voice carried the weight of old regrets. I know what it's like to wonder if you could have done something different, said something different, been something different that might have changed the outcome. And what did you conclude? Naruto asked, finally turning to look at his mentor. When you were wondering all those things? Jiraiya was quiet for a long moment. That some people are determined to walk their own path, no matter how much we care about them or how hard we try to save them. That sometimes the best thing you can do is let them go and focus on the people you can still help. Is that what you did? Let them go. The question hit harder than Jiraiya had expected. Because the honest answer was no, he'd spent years chasing after his own lost students, trying to find some way to bring them back to the light. Orochimaru, Nagato, even Minato in his own way. He'd never learned to let go, never stopped carrying the weight of their choices. It's what I should have done, he said finally. It's what I'm trying to teach you to do. Do you hear that, kid? He wants to teach you to abandon those you care about, to accept their loss and move on to more convenient relationships. How very like them, to disguise callousness as wisdom. Maybe I don't want to learn that lesson, Naruto said quietly. Maybe I don't want to become the kind of person who gives up on people. It's not giving up, it's what? Naruto's voice carried an edge that made Jiraiya straighten in his swing. It's being practical. It's being realistic. It's accepting that some people aren't worth the effort. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Naruto stood abruptly, his swings swaying empty behind him. Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you're telling me to stop caring about the people who matter most to me, to accept their loss as inevitable and focus on being a better weapon for the people who sent me to fail in the first place. Jiraiya blinked at the venom in his student's voice. This wasn't the Naruto he knew, the boy who never gave up, who insisted on believing in people even when they didn't deserve it. This version was harder, more cynical, more willing to see ill intent in good advice. Naruto, listen to me. The Nine Tails chakra, it can influence your emotions, make you more aggressive, more paranoid. I think that's what's happening here. And there it is, Kit. When faced with your legitimate anger, your justified resentment, your reasonable questions, he blames me. As if your ability to think clearly were somehow my corruption rather than your growth. Don't, Naruto said, his voice dropping to something dangerously quiet. Don't you dare blame the fox for this. My feelings are my own. The fox. Jiraiya's eyes sharpened. You're talking to it? Directly? We have conversations sometimes. So what? So what? Jiraiya was on his feet now, his casual demeanor replaced by genuine alarm. Naruto, that thing is not your friend. It's a demon of pure malice and hatred, sealed inside you to prevent it from destroying everything you care about. If it's talking to you, influencing your thoughts, it's not influencing anything. The words came out louder than Naruto had intended, sharp enough to make several birds take flight from nearby trees. It's listening to me. It's the only thing in this village that actually listens to me without trying to tell me how I should feel, or what I should think, or who I should be willing to sacrifice. The silence that followed was heavy with implications neither of them wanted to examine. Jiraiya stared at his student, seeing something in those blue eyes that made his chest tight with growing dread. Naruto, he said carefully, I need you to listen to me very carefully. The Nine Tails is not your friend. It doesn't care about your well-being or your feelings. Everything it tells you is designed to isolate you from the people who actually care about you, to make you distrust the bonds that keep you human. And what if those bonds were never real to begin with? Naruto asked, what if the people who actually care about me only care about what I can do for them? That's not true, isn't it? Naruto began pacing, his movements sharp and agitated. Name one person in this village who values me as a person rather than as a weapon. One person who's shown genuine interest in my well-being rather than my combat effectiveness. One person who's ever asked what I want instead of telling me what I should want. Jiraiya opened his mouth to respond, then stopped, because when he tried to think of examples, the list was disturbingly short. Even his own relationship with Naruto was built around training and missions and preparing him for greater challenges. When was the last time they'd simply talked about Naruto's hopes and dreams and fears without it being connected to his role as a ninja? Silence speaks volumes, doesn't it, Kit? Even he cannot deny the truth of what you've observed. The village needs you, Jiraiya said finally, falling back on larger justifications when personal ones failed him. You're important to... The village needs the Nine Tails, Naruto corrected. I'm just a container it happens to be stuck in. That's not true. You're special, Naruto. You're the child of prophecy. The words were meant to be encouraging, inspiring, a reminder of Naruto's greater destiny. Instead, they had exactly the opposite effect. Naruto stopped pacing and turned to stare at his mentor with an expression that was part disbelief, part bitter amusement. The child of prophecy, he repeated, is that supposed to make me feel better? It should make you understand how important you are. The prophecy speaks of a student who will either bring peace to the world or destroy it utterly. You have the power to do what other people expect me to do, Naruto finished. To fulfill a destiny that someone else wrote for me. To be the hero or villain that the story requires. To shape my entire life around meeting the expectations of a prediction I had no part in creating. Jiraiya frowned. This wasn't how Naruto was supposed to react to learning about his prophetic importance. He should have been excited, honored, eager to live up to his destiny. The prophecy is a gift, Jiraiya said. It means you're chosen for something greater than... It's another leash. Naruto's voice was flat, certain. Another way to control me, to make sure I do what you want me to do instead of what I want to do. First, I'm a Nine Tails container who has to stay loyal to protect the village. Then I'm the failed teammate who has to prove himself by bringing back Sasuke. Now I'm the prophetic child who has to save or damn the entire world according to someone else's vision. He speaks of prophecies while ignoring your pain, Kit. He offers you grand destinies while dismissing your simple need for acceptance and understanding. Do you see how they operate? Always the larger picture, never the individual cost. When do I get to choose? Naruto asked, his voice carrying a weight that made Jiraiya want to step back. When do I get to decide what I want my life to be instead of having it decided for me by village needs and prophetic requirements and other people's expectations? Naruto, you're letting the fox poison your thoughts. Stop blaming the fox. The shout echoed across the empty playground. Stop dismissing everything I think and feel as demonic corruption. Maybe, just maybe, I'm capable of having my own thoughts about my own life. Jiraiya held up his hands in a placating gesture. I'm not trying to dismiss your feelings. I'm trying to help you understand that the Nine Tails is the only thing in this village that acknowledges my feelings exist, Naruto said. It doesn't tell me how I should feel about being treated like a weapon. It doesn't explain why I should be grateful for scraps of acceptance. It doesn't promise me that things will get better if I just keep being the perfect little soldier. And what does it tell you instead? The question hung between them like a challenge. Naruto was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was soft enough that Jiraiya had to strain to hear it. It tells me the truth, that I've spent my entire life trying to earn something that was never going to be given freely. That I've been fighting for people who see me as a tool rather than a person. That maybe it's time to stop caring more about their approval than they care about my well-being. Wise words, kid. You are learning to see clearly at last. Jiraiya felt something cold settle in his stomach. This wasn't just teenage rebellion or temporary disillusionment. This was his student beginning to question the fundamental assumptions that kept him loyal to Konoha, that kept him fighting for others rather than himself. The village made mistakes, he said carefully, but that doesn't mean. It means exactly what it means, Naruto interrupted. And what it means is that maybe I should stop making their problems my problems. Maybe I should start thinking about what I want instead of what they need. And what do you want? It should have been a simple question. But as Naruto stood there in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the ghosts of his lonely childhood, he realized he couldn't answer it. He'd spent so many years focused on gaining acceptance, proving his worth, earning his place in the village that he'd never stopped to consider what he actually wanted from his life. All he knew for certain was that it wasn't this. It wasn't being the perfect weapon, the prophetic savior, the loyal ninja who bled for people who would never truly accept him. It wasn't carrying everyone else's burdens while being denied the simple human connections that made those burdens bearable. I don't know, he said finally, but I know it's not what I have now. The first step toward freedom, kid. Admitting that your current path leads nowhere you want to go. Jiraiya saw the danger in that admission, saw the way his student was pulling back from everything that had once motivated him. But instead of addressing the underlying pain, instead of acknowledging the legitimate grievances that were driving Naruto toward isolation, he did what shinobi were trained to do. He focused on containing the threat. We need to work on your seal, he said. Strengthen the barriers between you and the Nine Tails. If it's influencing your thoughts to this degree. It's not influencing my thoughts, Naruto said tiredly. It's just the only thing willing to validate them. Naruto, listen to me. The prophecy. The prophecy can go to hell. The words were said quietly, without heat, but they hit Jiraiya like a physical blow. I'm not anyone's chosen child. I'm not anyone's weapon. I'm not anyone's savior. I'm just Naruto, and maybe that should be enough. He turned and began walking away from the playground, leaving Jiraiya standing alone among the empty swings. Where are you going? Jiraiya called after him. Home, Naruto replied without turning around. To think about things. As his student disappeared into the maze of Konoha streets, Jiraiya remained standing in the gathering darkness, a growing certainty settling in his chest like a weight. He was losing him. The boy who had once embodied hope and determination and unshakable faith in the power of bonds was walking away, and Jiraiya had no idea how to bring him back. Worse, he was beginning to suspect that his own approach, focusing on power and prophecy and greater purpose while ignoring the basic human needs that drove everything else, had played a role in pushing Naruto away in the first place. First consideration of leaving, the report would later say. Subject displaying increasing alienation from support structures and mentor figures. Emotional bonds weakening rapidly. Recommand immédiate intervention. But by the time that report was written, it would already be too late. In his small apartment, Naruto sat on his bed and stared at the ceiling, Jiraiya's words echoing in his mind. The child of prophecy, chosen for greatness or destruction. Another burden, another expectation, another reason why his life belonged to other people rather than himself. For the first time since returning to Konoha, he seriously considered what it would be like to simply leave, to walk away from the village, the expectations, the prophecies, and all the people who saw him as anything other than just Naruto. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like the first honest idea he'd had in years. Yes, Kit, let that thought grow. Let it take root. There's a whole world beyond these walls, beyond their narrow vision of what you should be. Perhaps it's time you explored it. For once, Naruto didn't argue with the fox's suggestion. Chapter 7, Bonds Fraying. The training ground, where Team 7 had once learned to work together, felt like a graveyard. Naruto arrived exactly on time for what Kakashi had optimistically called a team meeting, though everyone knew it was really an intervention disguised as training. The copy ninja had been making increasingly desperate attempts to restore some semblance of their old dynamic, sending messages to both surviving members of Team 7 with requests that felt more like pleas. Sakura was already there, standing near the memorial stone with her arms crossed and her pink hair catching the morning light. She looked up when Naruto approached, and the expression on her face made his steps falter. Where there had once been warmth, concern, even the familiar exasperation of dealing with his antics, there was now something cold and accusatory that made his chest tight. "You're late," she said, though he wasn't. "I'm exactly on time," Naruto replied, settling into a defensive posture without thinking about it. "Are you? Because it feels like you've been late for everything that mattered for months now." The words hit like a slap, precise and designed to wound. This wasn't the Sakura who used to scold him for being loud or punch him for saying something stupid. This was someone else wearing her face, someone harder, angrier, looking for someone to blame for a loss that was eating her alive. Listen to the venom in her voice, Kit. This is the same girl you once claimed to love, now speaking to you as if you were the enemy. Kakashi arrived a few minutes later, his usual tardiness somehow making the tension in the air even thicker. He took one look at the way Naruto and Sakura were positioned, carefully maintaining distance, avoiding eye contact, radiating hostility, and Naruto saw something die in his visible eye. "Right," Kakashi said with forced cheer. "I thought we could do some basic coordination exercises. Nothing too strenuous, just—" "What?" Sakura's voice cut through his attempt at normalcy like a blade. "What's the point of coordination exercises when we're not actually a team anymore?" "We are a team," Kakashi insisted. "We've always been a team, even when one of us abandons the village to join a psychopathic snake." Sakura's green eyes flashed as she turned to stare directly at Naruto. "Even when another one fails so completely to stop him that we have to accept he's never coming back." "Sakura-chan," Naruto said quietly, "that's not fair." "Not fair," she laughed, but there was no humor in it, just bitterness and grief and rage that had been building for weeks. "You want to talk about fair? Is it fair that Sasuke is gone? Is it fair that he's probably dead in some laboratory while that monster experiments on him? Is it fair that the person who promised to bring him back came home empty-handed and beaten half to death?" Each question was a knife twisted in wounds that were still bleeding. Naruto felt himself taking a step back, then another, as if physical distance could somehow protect him from the fury in her voice. "I tried," he said, and hated how small his voice sounded. "I gave everything I had." "Did you?" Sakura stepped closer, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Because from where I was sitting, it looked like you couldn't even last 5 minutes in a real fight with him. It looked like all your big talk about bringing him home was just that talk." "She blames you for her own weakness, Kit." She stood by and watched as Sasuke walked into darkness, did nothing to prevent his corruption, offered no alternatives to his thirst for power. And now she makes her failure your burden to carry. "I fought him," Naruto said, his own anger beginning to rise. "I bled for him. I nearly died trying to knock some sense into him. What did you do, Sakura-chan, besides stand there and let him walk away?" The slap came fast and hard, rocking his head to the side and leaving his cheeks stinging. But it was the look in Sakura's eyes that really hurt, pure hatred, as if he were personally responsible for every bad thing that had happened to Team 7. "Enough!" Kakashi stepped between them, his voice carrying the authority of command. Both of you, stop this. Now. Stop what? Sakura's voice was high and tight, with barely controlled hysteria. Stop telling the truth? Stop acknowledging that Naruto failed in the one thing that mattered most? Stop pretending that everything is fine when our teammate is gone and it's his fault. It's not his fault, Kakashi said firmly. Sasuke made his choice. No one could have. Anyone else could have done better. Sakura whirled on their sensei, her training temporarily forgotten in the face of her grief. Rock Lee would have done better. Neji would have done better. Hell, even Kiba would have done better because at least he wouldn't have held back. Held back. Naruto's voice was dangerous now, the kind of quiet that preceded storms. You think I held back? I think you were more worried about not hurting your precious Sasuke than you were about actually stopping him. Sakura shot back. I think you care more about maintaining your stupid rivalry than about bringing him home to the people who actually loved him. Do you hear her, Kit? She speaks of love while showering you with hatred. She speaks of failure while having contributed nothing to the solution herself. This is how they repay loyalty, with blame and accusation and demands that you bear the weight of their inadequacy. You want to know why I held back? Naruto's voice was rising now, his control slipping as weeks of suppressed pain and anger finally found a target. Because I still believed he was worth saving. Because I still thought there was good in him. Because I was stupid enough to think that bonds meant something. Bonds? Sakura laughed bitterly. What bonds? The bonds that let him put a Chidori through your chest? The bonds that made him choose power over friendship? The bonds that meant so little to him that he walked away without a second thought? The bonds that made me fight for him even when he was trying to kill me? Naruto shouted. The bonds that made me bleed and suffer and nearly die because I thought he was worth it. The bonds that apparently meant more to me than they did to anyone else on this team. If they meant so much to you, then why is he gone? Sakura's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more impact than any scream. If you cared so much, if you tried so hard, if you gave everything you had, then why are we standing here without him? The question hung in the air like a curse, unanswerable and devastating. Because the horrible truth was that Naruto didn't know. He'd replayed that fight at the Valley of the End 1,000 times, analyzing every moment, every choice, every word spoken between them. And he still couldn't identify the crucial moment where everything went wrong, the key decision that might have changed the outcome. All he knew was that he'd failed and Sasuke was gone, and now even the people who should have understood his loss were turning their pain into weapons against him. That's enough, Kakashi said again, but his voice lacked conviction now. Even he seemed shaken by the venom in Sakura's words, the complete breakdown of anything resembling team cohesion. No, it's not enough, Sakura continued, her gaze never leaving Naruto's face. It's not nearly enough, because Sasuke is still gone, and Orochimaru still has him, and we're still sitting here pretending that everything is fine when our team is broken beyond repair. Maybe, Naruto said quietly. It was broken long before Sasuke left. The words came out without conscious thought, but once spoken, they felt true in a way that made his chest ache. Because looking back at their time as Team 7, how much of their supposed bond had been real? How much had been genuine friendship versus proximity and shared experiences? How much had been actual caring versus the kind of casual affection that develops between people who spend time together? Sasuke had walked away from all of it without apparent regret. Sakura was standing here, blaming him for losses that belonged to all of them. Kakashi was trying to force them back into patterns that had never been as strong as they pretended. Maybe the bonds he believed in so desperately had always been more illusion than reality. Now you begin to see, Kit. The connections you treasured were chains they used to bind you to their expectations. When those connections no longer serve their purpose, they discard them without hesitation. But they expect you to remain loyal to bonds they've already abandoned. What's that supposed to mean? Sakura demanded. It means maybe we were never as close as we pretended to be, Naruto said, his voice growing steadier as a strange calm settled over him. Maybe we were just three kids thrown together by circumstance, telling ourselves we were a family because it was easier than admitting we were strangers. That's not true, Kakashi protested. You three were. Were what? Naruto turned to look at his sensei directly. A team? When did we ever actually work as a team? Sasuke did his thing. Sakura supported whatever Sasuke wanted to do, and I tagged along making noise and hoping someone would notice me. That's not a team. That's a comedy act with delusions of significance. You're being unfair, Sakura said, but there was less heat in her voice now, as if some part of her recognized the truth in his assessment. Am I? Tell me, Sakura-chan, when was the last time you asked me how I was doing? Not how my training was going, not whether I was getting stronger, not if I was ready for the next mission. When was the last time you cared about me as a person instead of as Sasuke's rival or the team's loudmouth? The silence that followed was damning in its completeness, because the honest answer was never, even during their closest moments. Even when she'd been concerned about his injuries or proud of his accomplishments, it had always been in the context of his role on the team rather than genuine interest in his well-being. And you, Kakashi-sensei, Naruto continued, his gaze shifting to their instructor. When was the last time you treated me like a student instead of a project? When was the last time you taught me something because you thought I'd benefit from it instead of because it serves some larger strategic purpose? Kakashi opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. Because the uncomfortable truth was that his relationship with Naruto had always been defined by external factors, controlling the Nine Tails, preparing for greater threats, managing the boy's emotional state to maintain his loyalty to the village. He'd never simply been Naruto's teacher in the way he'd been Sasuke's. This is what the Nine Tails is doing to you, Kakashi said finally, falling back on familiar explanations. It's making you paranoid, making you see enemies where there are friends. Stop. The word came out sharp enough to make both of his former teammates flinch. Stop blaming the fox for things you don't want to hear. Stop dismissing every criticism as demonic corruption. Stop refusing to examine your own actions by claiming that any negative reaction to them must be supernatural manipulation. They cannot bear to look at themselves honestly, Kit. It is easier to paint you as corrupted than to admit they have failed you as teammates, as friends, as family. The Nine Tails is influencing you, Sakura insisted. You're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years, Naruto said. I'm seeing things as they actually are instead of how I wish they were. And what I see is that the bonds I thought we shared were always more important to me than they were to either of you. He began walking away from the training ground, from a memorial stone, from the site of so many supposed victories that felt hollow in retrospect. Where are you going? Kakashi called after him. Somewhere else, Naruto replied without turning around. Somewhere I don't have to pretend that broken things can be fixed with good intentions and team-building exercises. Naruto, wait. But he was already gone, leaving behind two people who had once meant everything to him and now felt like strangers wearing familiar faces. That evening, Naruto found himself at Ichiraku Ramen, seeking comfort in the one place that had never demanded anything from him except payment for food. Tucci served him his usual with a smile that was warm but worried, clearly sensing something different in his most loyal customer. Everything all right, Naruto? The old man asked as he ladled broth into a bowl. It was such a simple question, asked with genuine concern rather than ulterior motive. The kind of basic human consideration that should have been commonplace but felt precious in its rarity. Just thinking about things, Naruto replied, accepting the bowl gratefully. Heavy thoughts from the look of it. Naruto nodded, taking a sip of the familiar broth and feeling some of the tension in his shoulders ease. Tucci-san, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think people can change? Really change, I mean. Not just get stronger or learn new skills, but fundamentally become someone different. The ramen chef was quiet for a moment, wiping down his counter while he considered the question. I think people can become who they really are, he said finally. Sometimes we spend years being who we think others want us to be, or who we think we should be. But eventually, if we're lucky, we get the chance to discover who we actually are underneath all those expectations. Wisdom from an unexpected source, Kit. Perhaps this is what you've been missing. Not the grand pronouncements of prophecy and destiny, but simple truth from someone who asks nothing of you except the price of a bowl of noodles. And what if who you really are isn't who people want you to be? Naruto asked. Tucci smiled, and there was sadness in it, the kind that came from personal experience rather than abstract sympathy. Then you have a choice to make, he said. You can keep pretending to be someone else for their comfort, or you can be honest about who you are and deal with the consequences. Neither choice is easy, but only one of them lets you live with yourself. Naruto finished his ramen in contemplative silence, paying for his meal and leaving a generous tip. As he prepared to leave, Tucci caught his arm gently. For what it's worth, the old man said quietly, I've always liked who you actually are, Naruto. Not the ninja, not the hero, not the vessel for great power, just the boy who sits at my counter and talks about his day. Don't let anyone convince you that person isn't worth being. Outside, walking through streets that felt less like home with each passing day, Naruto carried those words like a small flame against the growing darkness in his heart. One person, at least, had seen him clearly and found him acceptable. It was more than he could say for the teammates who had once sworn to stand beside him no matter what. One honest voice among a chorus of lies and expectations. Kit, remember this feeling, the relief of being accepted without condition, valued without requirement. Remember it, and ask yourself why it should be so rare in your life. As he made his way back to his empty apartment, Naruto found himself thinking less about Team 7 and more about the possibility of finding other people, other places where simple acceptance might be the rule rather than the miraculous exception. The thought didn't terrify him anymore. If anything, it felt like Hope. Chapter 8, the point of no return. The festival of the autumn moon had always been Naruto's least favorite time of year. It wasn't the celebration itself that bothered him. The paper lanterns strung between buildings, the smell of grilled food wafting through the streets, the sound of laughter and music that turned all of Konoha into one giant party. Under different circumstances, he might have loved the warmth and community spirit that transformed his village into something magical. But those circumstances had never existed for him. Standing at the edge of the main festival square, watching families share meals and friends toast each other's health and couples dance under the starlight, Naruto felt like a ghost haunting someone else's celebration. He was physically present but fundamentally separate, able to observe but never truly participate in the joy surrounding him. Look at them, Kit. See how easily they forget the blood you've shed in their service, the pain you've endured for their safety. Tonight they feast and dance while you stand alone in the shadows, invisible despite everything you've sacrificed for their happiness. Kurama's voice had become a constant presence over the past weeks, offering commentary that grew more persuasive with each passing day. The fox was right, as it so often was. These people live their lives in blissful ignorance of the cost of their peace, content to enjoy the benefits of his protection while denying him even basic inclusion in their community. Naruto pulled his hood up and moved deeper into the crowd, hoping that anonymity might make the isolation more bearable. For a while, it worked. Lost among the festival goers, he could almost pretend he belonged here, that the laughter and warmth extended to him as well. That illusion shattered the moment someone recognized him. Is that? A woman's voice, sharp with sudden alarm. The Uzumaki boy, her companion confirmed. What's he doing here? The whispers spread like ripples in a pond, and suddenly there was space around him that hadn't existed moments before. Not obvious enough to be called outright exclusion, but unmistakable in its intent. A bubble of discomfort that marked him as unwelcome in his own village's celebration. He tried to ignore it, try to focus on the performances and food stalls in traditional games. But everywhere he went, conversations died when he approached and resumed in hushed tones after he passed. Children who had been playing loudly fell silent when their parents noticed his presence. Merchants who had been calling out their wares suddenly found reasons to look elsewhere. They tolerate your presence because they must, but they will never truly accept you. You are the reminder of their own vulnerability, the living proof that their peace rests on foundations they'd rather not examine. Near the center of the square, a group of older villagers had gathered around a makeshift shrine, offering prayers for the continued prosperity and safety of Konoha. Naruto found himself drifting toward them, drawn by some masochistic impulse to hear what blessings they asked for their village. Protect us from those who would harm our children. Keep the demons at bay. Grant us peace in these troubled times. Standard prayers, the kind offered at every festival. But as he drew closer, the conversation shifted from formal supplication to more casual discussion. Hard to believe it's been 2 months since the Uchiha boy left. One of them was saying. Tragic loss, another agreed. Such potential, wasted on revenge. The village isn't the same without him. He could have been one of our greatest protectors. Instead, we're left with. The speaker's voice dropped to a whisper, but Naruto's enhanced hearing caught every word. Well, let's just say the quality of our remaining young ninja leaves something to be desired. Listen carefully, Kit. Hear how they speak of the one who abandoned them versus the one who has never wavered in his loyalty. Don't say that too loudly, someone else cautioned. You know how sensitive the Hokage is about certain topics. Sensitive or not, it's the truth. The Uchiha was clan nobility, a prodigy who could have restored his bloodline and strengthened the village immeasurably. Instead, we're stuck with another meaningful pause, less desirable alternatives. Naruto's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he remained hidden in the shadows, morbidly compelled to hear more. The mission to retrieve him was a disaster, continued the first speaker. Good ninja injured, resources wasted, and for what? So that boy could prove he's as useless as we always suspected. Should never have sent him in the first place. Everyone knows he's more liability than asset. The demon's influence, most likely, probably sabotaged the mission deliberately, couldn't stand the thought of the village getting its precious Uchiha back. The words hit like physical blows, each one more devastating than the last. These people, his people, the ones he'd sworn to protect, genuinely believed he had deliberately failed to save Sasuke. They thought his inability to bring back his teammate was born of malice rather than inadequacy. Do you hear them, Kit? This is what they truly think of you. Not just incompetence, but active sabotage. Not just failure, but betrayal. They would rather believe you evil than admit that their golden Uchiha chose darkness willingly. Honestly, one of the villagers continued, the village might be better off if positions were reversed. If the demon container had been the one to leave, we'd still have the Uchiha's abilities without the constant threat of other problems. Don't speak like that, someone protested weakly. The boy has served the village faithfully. Has he? Or has he simply been following orders because he had no choice? Mark my words, the moment he decides his leash is too tight, we'll see his true nature. And it won't be pretty. At least the Uchiha's betrayal was honest. Clean. He wanted power and went where he could find it. But that one, the speaker gestured vaguely in Naruto's direction, though they couldn't see him in the shadows. That one pretends loyalty while carrying the seed of our destruction. I'd rather face an honest enemy than a false friend. Chill. Lower your voices. Why? It's not like anyone disagrees. Half the village thinks the same thing. We just can't say it openly. Sometimes I wonder if we wouldn't have been better off if he died in that fight at the valley. Then at least we'd only have one problem to worry about instead of two. The conversation continued, but Naruto could no longer process the words. The blood rushing in his ears drowned out everything else except the pounding of his own heartbeat and the voice that had become his most constant companion. They wish you were dead, Kit. Not imprisoned, not exiled, not controlled dead. They would rather mourn the loss of their demon container than live with the inconvenience of your humanity. This is what your loyalty has earned you. This is what your sacrifice has purchased. He turned and walked away from the square, away from the celebration, away from the people whose prayers included his death as a reasonable solution to their problems. His feet carried him through empty side streets while his mind struggled to process what he'd heard. They wished he was dead. Not metaphorically, not theoretically, literally dead, removed from their world so completely that they could pretend he'd never existed at all. The boy who had saved their village multiple times, who had bled and suffered and nearly died in service to their safety, was seen as a burden they'd be happier without. Now you understand the truth of your situation, Kit. You are not their hero. You are their necessary evil, tolerated only as long as you remain useful and harmless. The moment you become inconvenient, the moment you demand anything for yourself, they will turn on you without hesitation. By the time his aimless wandering brought him back to his apartment building, the festival was winding down. Laughter still drifted through his windows, but it sounded hollow now, exclusionary, a celebration of a community that had never included him and never would. He sat on his bed in the darkness, not bothering to turn on the lights. The photographs scattered across his dresser, Team 7, various friends and acquaintances, moments he'd treasured as evidence of his belonging, looked back at him like lies he'd told himself to make the loneliness bearable. You don't have to endure this, Kit. There's a whole world beyond these walls, beyond their narrow vision of what you should be. Places where strength is respected rather than feared, where loyalty is a choice rather than a chain, where you could be valued for what you are instead of tolerated for what you represent. Where, he whispered to the empty room, wherever you choose to go, you are powerful beyond their comprehension, skilled beyond their ability to contain. The only thing keeping you trapped in this cycle of abuse and ingratitude is your own misguided sense of obligation to people who would celebrate your death. Naruto closed his eyes and tried to imagine it, walking away from Konoha, from the expectations and disappointments and constant surveillance. No more solo missions designed to keep him busy and isolated. No more lectures about responsibility from people who had never taken responsibility for their own failures. No more pretending that bonds existed where there was only exploitation. The image should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like the first honest breath he'd taken in months. Freedom, Kit. Not the false freedom they offer you. The freedom to serve, the freedom to suffer, the freedom to sacrifice yourself for their benefit, but true freedom. The freedom to choose your own path, your own loyalties, your own definition of what makes a life worth living. They need me, Naruto said, but the words felt hollow. They need your power. They have never needed you as a person, and they have made that distinction abundantly clear. You are a weapon they've grown comfortable wielding. Nothing more, nothing less. What about my friends? What friends? The teammates who blame you for their failures? The sensei who taught your rival to kill rather than teaching you to live? The villagers who wish you were dead? Or perhaps you mean the few individuals who tolerate your presence without actively despising it? Is that really friendship, Kit? Is tolerance enough to base a life upon? Every question was a scalpel cutting away illusions he'd clung to for years. Because when he examined his relationships honestly, when he looked past his desperate need to belong and see the actual evidence of how people treated him, the list of genuine connections was depressingly short. Tucci at the ramen stand, who treated him with simple kindness. Irika, who cared but was too afraid of the village's judgment to offer more than distant support. Maybe a handful of others who didn't actively hate him but had never gone out of their way to include him either. Set against that meager collection of lukewarm acceptance was an entire village that saw him as a necessary evil at best and an active threat at worst. You have given them everything, your loyalty, your service, your blood, your pain, your childhood, your adolescence, your dreams of belonging. And what have they given you in return? Suspicion, isolation, conditional tolerance, and prayers for your death. How long will you continue this one-sided relationship? Kit, how much more of yourself are you willing to sacrifice for people who would not mourn your loss? Dawn was breaking outside his windows, painting everything in shades of gold and orange that should have been beautiful but felt like mockery. Another day in paradise. Another 24 hours of pretending that his life here was something other than elaborately disguised imprisonment. He looked around his small apartment. At the mission reports stacked on his desk, the training weights gathered in the corner, the photographs of people who had never really seen him as anything more than a useful tool. This was what his loyalty had bought him. A cage decorated to look like a home, a community that tolerated his presence while dreaming of his absence. You can walk away, Kit. Right now, this moment. Pack what matters and leave behind what doesn't. There are other places in this world, other possibilities you've never been allowed to explore. You could discover who you really are when you're not constantly trying to earn the acceptance of people determined to withhold it. For the first time in his life, the idea didn't feel like betrayal or abandonment or failure. It felt like self-preservation, like choosing life over slow death, dignity over degradation, honest solitude over false community. Naruto stood and walked to his dresser, pulling out a backpack and beginning to pack. Essential supplies, favorite clothes, a few personal items that couldn't be replaced. He left the photographs where they were. Let someone else deal with the evidence of connections that had never been as strong as he'd pretended. At the bottom of his backpack, he placed the single most precious thing he owned, the small photograph of the fourth Hokage that he'd discovered years ago. Not because Minato represented Konoha or duty or sacrifice, but because he was the only person who had ever looked at Naruto with unconditional love, even if that love had lasted only moments after his birth. He sealed the bag and slung it over his shoulders, taking one last look around the apartment that had been his prison and his sanctuary for so many years. On his desk, he left a single piece of paper with a message written in his careful handwriting. I've got to find someplace where being myself is enough. Don't look for me. I won't be coming back. Naruto. Simple, direct, final. No explanations or justifications that they wouldn't understand anyway. Just the truth, stated plainly for anyone who cared to read it. The sun was fully up by the time he reached the village gates, the morning shift of guards just taking their positions. They knew him by sight, of course, but solo missions weren't uncommon, and he'd been taking them regularly for weeks. Morning, Naruto, one of them called. Early start today? Something like that, he replied, not bothering to lie about his destination. They waved him through without question, focused on the paperwork and routine of changing shifts. Within minutes, he was beyond the walls of Konoha, walking down a road that led away from everything he'd ever known. He didn't look back. Freedom, Kit. How does it feel? Naruto considered the question as he walked, feeling the morning sun on his face and the weight of possibility in his chest. Behind him lay a village that had never truly wanted him, people who had never truly accepted him, a life defined by other people's expectations and limitations. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the terrifying prospect of discovering who he really was when stripped of all the roles and responsibilities that had been imposed upon him. It feels, he said quietly, like the first honest choice I've ever made. The first of many, I hope. The world is vast, Kit, and there are places in it where strength is valued over sentiment, where loyalty is earned rather than extracted, where you could find the belonging that has been denied you here. As the sun climbed higher and Konoha disappeared behind him, Naruto walked toward an unknown future with something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the desperate, clinging hope of eventual acceptance from people determined to withhold it, but the clean, honest hope of finding something better. Somewhere in the distance, a new life was waiting for him. He was finally free to go find it. End of Chapter 8. End of Part 1. The Breaking Point. The boy who had once sworn to become Hokage walked away from his village at dawn, carrying nothing but his pain and the growing certainty that some bonds were meant to be broken. Behind him, Konoha slept peacefully, unaware that their greatest weapon had just chosen freedom over service, dignity over duty, and his own humanity over their expectations. The Nine Tails Whispers had found fertile ground in legitimate grievances, real pain, and genuine isolation. What grew from those seeds would reshape the ninja world in ways no prophecy had ever predicted. Part 2. A lone wolf's journey would begin with a boy learning to survive without the safety net of village support, discovering abilities and alliances that would transform him from a failed hero into something far more dangerous. A powerful individual with nothing left to lose and no one left to protect. The child of prophecy was walking away from the light, and nobody was coming to bring him back. Chapter 9. Exodus. The morning sun felt different on his face, harsher somehow, less forgiving than it had ever been within Konoha's walls. Naruto had been walking for 3 hours, following a merchant road that led northeast toward the land of hot water, and already the familiar weight of the village at his back was gone, replaced by something he'd never experienced before: complete isolation. It should have been terrifying. Instead, as he crested a hill and looked back to see no trace of Konoha's walls or towers on the horizon, he felt something close to relief. For the first time in his life, no one was watching him, evaluating him, judging his every action against impossible standards. He was just Naruto, walking down a road toward an uncertain future, and that anonymity felt like the most precious gift he'd ever received. "How does freedom taste, Kit?" Kurama's voice held a note of satisfaction that hadn't been there during their conversations in the village. "Different from the scraps they fed you, I imagine." "Different," Naruto agreed, adjusting his backpack straps. "Scary, but different." Fear is natural when cages are opened. Most prisoners become so accustomed to their bars that they forget the world exists beyond them. You at least had the courage to step outside. The compliment, if that's what it was, surprised him. In all their interactions, Kurama had never offered praise for anything except violence or displays of power. This felt different, more personal, as if the fox actually approved of his choice to leave. "Where am I going?" Naruto asked, voicing the question that had been nagging at him since he'd passed through Konoha's gates. "Wherever you wish. For the first time in your life, that choice is entirely yours to make." The concept was so alien that Naruto almost stumbled. He'd never made a major decision without considering how it would affect his standing in the village, his relationships with his teammates, his progress toward becoming Hokage. Now, suddenly, those considerations were irrelevant. He could go anywhere, do anything, become anyone he wanted to be. The freedom was intoxicating and paralyzing in equal measure. By midday, he'd reached a crossroads where the main merchant route split into 3 different paths. A weathered signpost indicated distances to various towns and cities, each name representing possibilities he'd never considered before. To the north, the land of hot water, known for its neutral status and peaceful hot springs. To the east, smaller villages in Fire Country's borderlands, places where a skilled ninja could find mercenary work. To the west, deeper into Fire Country, but away from Konoha's direct influence. "Choose based on your needs, not your fears," Kurama advised. "What do you require most right now?" Naruto considered the question seriously. He needed money, food, shelter, and most importantly, he needed distance from anyone who might recognize him and attempt to drag him back to his old life. The northern route seemed safest. The land of hot water's neutrality meant fewer questions asked, and the hot springs might provide opportunities for work that didn't involve violence. He took the northern path. The first sign that his new life wouldn't be as simple as walking away came that evening, when the sun began to set and he realized he had no idea how to camp in the wilderness. Oh, he knew the theory. Academy classes had covered basic survival techniques, and he'd been on missions that involved overnight stays in the field. But those missions had always included teammates who handled the details. Sasuke's Uchiha training had included wilderness survival. Sakura had studied extensively, and Kakashi had simply taken care of things with the casual competence of someone who'd been doing it for decades. Naruto had never actually built a fire from scratch, never purified water from stream, never identified which plants were safe to eat and which weren't. He'd been the loud, enthusiastic member of Team 7, the one who provided combat power and determination while others handled the more technical aspects of mission planning. Now, standing in a clearing beside a small stream as darkness fell around him, he felt the first real pangs of uncertainty about his decision to leave. Second thoughts already, Kit? No, Naruto said firmly, though his voice carried less conviction than he'd intended. I can figure this out. How hard can it be? Harder than you imagine, easier than you fear. Humans managed to survive for thousands of years before villages and mission supplies. You simply need to remember skills that civilization has made you forget. With Kurama offering occasional guidance, Naruto managed to get a small fire, started using techniques he half remembered from old lessons. The flames cast dancing shadows across the trees around his makeshift camp, creating a pocket of warmth and light that pushed back the darkness but couldn't quite banish his growing hunger. He brought some travel rations from his apartment, but they wouldn't last more than a few days. If he was going to survive on his own, he needed to learn to find food in the wilderness. The stream provided clean water once he'd purified it with a basic jutsu, but sustenance was a more complex problem. There were berries growing on bushes near the water's edge, dark purple clusters that looked appetizing in the firelight. Naruto had eaten berries before during missions, though usually someone else had identified them as safe first. These looked similar to ones he remembered, and his empty stomach was making the decision feel urgent. Careful, Kit. Not all that appears nourishing will sustain you. They look like the ones we ate during the mission to Wave Country, Naruto said, reaching for a cluster. Do they? Look more closely. Naruto paused, studying the berries more carefully. They were the right color, the right size, growing in the right kind of cluster. But something about them felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. A subtle difference in the way the light reflected off their surface, maybe, or the particular shade of their darkness. Trust your instincts, Kit. What does your body tell you about those berries? When Naruto really focused, setting aside his hunger and his desire for a simple solution, he could sense something off about the plant. Not obviously dangerous, but not quite right either. The feeling was subtle, like a whisper at the edge of consciousness, but unmistakably present. He pulled his hand back. Wise choice. Those berries would not have killed you, but they would have made you very sick for several days. Your instincts are better than you realize. You simply need to learn to listen to them. How do you know what they are? Naruto asked. I have been sealed within Jinchuriki for decades, Kit. I have felt their experiences, their hungers, their struggles to survive. Knowledge accumulates over time, and I share what I have learned with those who prove worthy of it. The idea that Kurama was offering him knowledge earned through the experiences of previous hosts was both fascinating and disturbing. How many others had the Fox guided through moments of survival and desperation? What happened to them? Naruto asked quietly. The other Jinchuriki you've known? They died, Kurama replied matter-of-factly. Some in battle, some from the strain of containing my power, some from the isolation and hatred that comes with being a demon container. All of them died younger than they should have, worn down by burdens they never chose to carry. Is that what's going to happen to me? That depends entirely on the choices you make from this point forward. Unlike them, you have recognized the futility of seeking acceptance from those determined to withhold it. Unlike them, you have chosen to walk away from the systems that would consume you. Your fate is not sealed, Kit. It is yours to determine. Naruto stared into the fire, watching the flames dance and shift as he processed Kurama's words. The fox was offering him something no one else ever had. complete agency over his own destiny. Not the false choice of becoming Hokage or failing his dreams. Not the narrow path of village service with its endless requirements and restrictions, but genuine freedom to decide what kind of person he wanted to become. It was the most terrifying and liberating realization of his life. He slept fitfully that first night and used the sounds of the forest and the vulnerability of having no walls around him. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, every distant animal call brought him partially awake, hand reaching instinctively for weapons that were never quite where he expected them to be. When dawn finally came, he was exhausted and disoriented, his body aching from sleeping on the ground and his mind fogged with the residue of uneasy dreams. The fire had died to cold ashes sometime during the night, leaving him shivering in the morning chill. Your first lesson in independence, Kit. Comfort is not guaranteed. It must be earned and maintained through constant vigilance. Naruto restarted the fire with numb fingers and heated water for tea, grateful for the small comforts that remained. As he sipped the hot liquid and felt warmth return to his body, he found himself thinking about his apartment in Konoha, the soft bed, the reliable heat, the easy access to hot food and clean water. He pushed those thoughts away. Comfort could be a cage as surely as any prison bar, and he'd chosen freedom over ease. The adjustment would be difficult, but it was necessary if he truly wanted to discover who he was beneath all the expectations and obligations that had shaped his life. After a breakfast of travel rations and stream water, he resumed his journey north. The road was less traveled here, winding through forests and hills that grew wilder with each passing mile. He saw other travelers occasionally, merchants with guards, lone wanderers like himself, the occasional patrol of ninja from villages he didn't recognize, but he avoided interaction, keeping to himself and drawing no attention. It was mid-afternoon when he made his first serious mistake. The berries grew beside a small pond where he'd stopped to refill his water bottles. They were different from the ones he'd almost eaten the night before, smaller, redder, growing in neat clusters that reminded him of ones he'd definitely eaten before during missions. His stomach had been growling for hours, his travel rations dwindling faster than expected, and these looked completely familiar. Kit. Kurama's voice carried a note of warning, but Naruto was already reaching for the berries. "These are definitely safe," he said, popping several in his mouth before the fox could finish its objection. "I've had these exact ones before." The taste was wrong immediately, too bitter with an acidic quality that made his mouth pucker and his throat burn. But he'd already swallowed, and within minutes, he could feel something happening to his body that had nothing to do with normal digestion. His vision blurred first, the world around him becoming soft and indistinct as if he were looking through water. Then came the nausea, sudden and overwhelming, followed by a weakness in his limbs that made standing difficult. His heart began racing, pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, and sweat broke out across his skin despite the cool afternoon air. "Fool boy." Kurama's voice was sharp with alarm. "Those berries contain a potent neurotoxin. Your body is shutting down to protect vital organs." Naruto tried to respond, but found he couldn't form words properly. His tongue felt thick and clumsy in his mouth, and his thoughts were becoming scattered and hard to hold on to. He stumbled toward the pond, thinking vaguely that water might help, but his legs gave out before he could reach it. The ground felt strangely soft when he hit it, though he knew intellectually that forest floor should be hard and uncomfortable. Everything was becoming distant, muffled, as if the world were moving away from him at tremendous speed. "Listen to me carefully, Kit. Your body cannot process this toxin on its own. You need my chakra to burn it out of your system. But using my power will change you, accelerate the bond between us. Are you willing to accept that consequence?" Through the fog of poison and approaching unconsciousness, Naruto tried to understand what Kurama was asking. Some distant part of his mind recognized that this was a crucial moment, a choice that would define their relationship going forward. But he was dying, and philosophical concerns seemed less important than survival. Yes, he thought, not sure if he'd spoken aloud or simply projected the word mentally. Then hold on, Kit. This will be intense. The sensation was unlike anything Naruto had ever experienced. Kurama's chakra flooded through him like liquid fire, burning through his veins and searing away the poison with violent efficiency. But it didn't stop there. It poured into spaces in his body and mind that had always been his alone, claiming territory and establishing connections that felt permanent and profound. He could feel Kurama's presence more clearly than ever before, not just as a voice in his head, but as an actual entity sharing his consciousness. The fox's emotions, ancient rage, bitter amusement, growing affection, mixed with his own until he couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. When the burning subsided and consciousness returned fully, Naruto found himself lying beside the pond with the taste of metal in his mouth and the feeling that he'd been fundamentally changed at a cellular level. He sat up slowly, testing his body's responses, and discovered that he felt stronger than before, not just recovered from the poisoning, but actually enhanced. The barriers between us have thinned considerably, Kit. From now on, my power will be more readily available to you, but my influence will also be more direct. We are becoming true partners rather than reluctant cohabitants. Is that good or bad? Naruto asked, though he suspected the answer was more complex than either option. It is what it is. Power always comes with a price, and freedom always requires sacrifice. You have chosen both power and freedom. Now you must learn to live with the consequences of those choices. As Naruto gathered his belongings and resumed his journey north, he could feel the truth of Kurama's words in every step he took. Something fundamental had shifted during those moments of shared desperation and mutual dependence. He was still himself, but he was also something more, something that had never existed before in the long history of Jinchuriki and their sealed demons. He was becoming a true partnership between human and fox, shaped by choice rather than forced by circumstance, motivated by mutual benefit rather than grudging coexistence. Behind him, in the shadows of the forest he'd left behind, figures observed his departure with interest that would have alarmed him if he'd been aware of their presence. In a cave hidden deep in the mountains of Rain Country, a figure with orange hair and ripple-pattern eyes received a report delivered by a raven that had traveled for days to reach its destination. Subject has departed Konoha permanently. Pain read aloud to his gathered subordinates. Displays increasing cooperation with Nine-Tails entity. Psychological isolation complete. Physical capabilities enhanced beyond previous assessments. Recommend transition to active recruitment phase. He set the message aside and looked around the cavern at the assembled members of Akatsuki, their faces hidden in shadow, but their attention focused entirely on his words. The child of prophecy walks alone, he announced. And power without purpose seeks direction. Perhaps it is time we offered him both. In the darkness, several figures nodded their understanding. The time for passive observation was ending. The time for direct action, and the recruitment of the most powerful Jinchuriki alive was about to begin. But Naruto, walking through forests that grew wilder with each passing mile, was unaware that his exodus from Konoha had triggered events that would reshape the ninja world. He was focused on simpler concerns, finding food that wouldn't kill him, water that was safe to drink, and shelter that would protect him from the elements. He was learning, step by painful step, that freedom was harder than servitude, that independence required skills he'd never needed to develop, and that true strength came not from others' approval, but from his own determination to survive and grow despite any obstacle. Well done, Kit. You survived your first real test of independence. There will be many more, but each one will make you stronger, more self-reliant, more truly yourself. As the sun set on his first full day away from Konoha, Naruto made camp beside another stream, built another fire, and settled in for another night of learning to live by his own choices rather than others' expectations. It was harder than anything he'd ever done. It was also the most honest life he'd ever lived. Chapter 10: Survival of the Fittest. Naruto had been on the road for 5 days when he learned his first hard lesson about the difference between being a Konoha ninja with backup and being a lone wanderer with nothing but his wits and whatever power he could muster. The lesson came in the form of 8 men with scarred faces and predatory grins, emerging from the forest on either side of the narrow mountain pass he'd been following toward the hot water border. They moved with the casual confidence of people who'd done this many times before, positioning themselves to block both his forward path and any retreat. Well, their leader said, a massive man with ritual scars covering his shaved head and a sword nearly as tall as Naruto strapped to his back. What do we have here? A lost little ninja, all alone in the big, scary wilderness. The others laughed, a sound devoid of humor that made Naruto's skin crawl. These weren't desperate men driven to banditry by circumstance. They were predators who enjoyed their work, who took pleasure in the fear they caused. Careful, kid. These ones have killed before, and recently. I can smell the blood on them. Naruto's hand moved instinctively toward his kunai pouch, but he forced himself to remain calm. 8 against 1 were poor odds, especially when he didn't know their capabilities, but maybe he could talk his way out of this without violence. I don't want any trouble, he said, keeping his voice steady. I'm just passing through. Oh, but trouble wants you, the leader replied, drawing his massive sword with a theatrical flourish. See, this here's our road, our territory, and travelers who want to use our road need to pay a toll. What kind of toll? Everything you've got, boy. Weapons, money, food, that nice backpack. The man's grin widened to show missing teeth. And maybe we'll let you keep walking instead of feeding you to the crows. Around him, the other bandits were also drawing weapons, swords, axes, a couple of crude spears. Not ninja gear, but effective enough against an unprepared target. They spread out further, closing off any possibility of escape through speed alone. They mean to kill you regardless of what you surrender, kid. I can taste their intentions. They're planning to take your belongings and your life. Negotiation is pointless. Naruto's options ran through his mind rapidly. He could try to break through their lines with pure speed, but the pass was narrow and they were positioned well. He could use shadow clones to even the odds, but that would reveal his ninja abilities and potentially attract unwanted attention from other sources. Or he could surrender and hope they kept their word, but Kurama was probably right about their ultimate intentions. I don't have much, he said, buying time while he assessed their positions more carefully. Just basic traveling supplies. We'll be the judge of that, another bandit said, this one wielding paired short swords with the easy familiarity of long practice. Drop your pack and weapons, nice and slow, and we might make this quick. That settled it. Naruto had spent too many years being underestimated, dismissed, and threatened by people who saw him as weak or expendable. He'd walked away from Konoha to escape that dynamic, not to find new versions of it in the wilderness. No, he said simply. The word seemed to surprise them. Clearly, they were used to their victims being more cooperative when faced with overwhelming odds and the promise of death. No, the leader's scarred face twisted with anger. Boy, you don't seem to understand the situation you're in. Understand it perfectly, Naruto replied, his voice taking on an edge that hadn't been there moments before. 8 of you, 1 of me, isolated location, no witnesses. You think that makes me helpless? He reached into his kunai pouch, but instead of producing a weapon, he simply stood there with his hand resting on the leather. You're wrong. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. The leader charging straight ahead with his massive sword raised, 2 others flanking him from the sides with their weapons extended. It was a coordinated assault that would have overwhelmed most single opponents. Naruto wasn't most opponents. Shadow Clone Jutsu produced 4 copies of himself, each one moving to intercept a different attacker. But these weren't the enthusiastic, slightly clumsy clones he'd relied on during his time in Konoha. These moved with a fluid efficiency that spoke of recent hard experience, each one focused entirely on disabling their target with maximum effectiveness. The leader's massive sword met a kunai that somehow managed to deflect the much larger blade, sending the bandit stumbling past his intended target. Before he could recover, the clone had driven an elbow into his kidney with enough force to drop him to his knees, gasping in pain. The flanking attackers fared no better. One found his spear turned against him, its point redirected into his own thigh with surgical precision. The other discovered that ninja reflexes were considerably faster than bandit expectations, his paired swords useless against an opponent who was simply no longer where he'd been aiming. In less than 30 seconds, 3 of the 8 bandits were down, nursing injuries that had taken them completely out of the fight. Efficient, but you're holding back too much, Kit. These predators understand only strength and death. Anything less will be interpreted as weakness. The remaining 5 bandits had regrouped, their casual confidence replaced by wary respect. They'd clearly expected to overwhelm a lone traveler with superior numbers and intimidation. Instead, they found themselves facing something that fought with skills they didn't recognize and tactics they couldn't counter. "What the hell are you?" one of them demanded. "Someone who's tired of being underestimated," Naruto replied. This time, they all attacked at once, abandoning coordination in favor of overwhelming aggression. 8 weapons. The 3 wounded bandits had rejoined the fight despite their injuries. Came at him from every angle, a storm of steel that left no room for evasion or clever maneuvering. It should have been impossible to defend against. Instead, Naruto felt something shift inside him, a reservoir of power that had always been there, but never quite this accessible. Kurama's chakra flooded through his system. Not the painful burning sensation he remembered from past emergencies, but a smooth integration that enhanced every aspect of his physical capabilities. His speed increased beyond anything he'd achieved before. His strength multiplied until blocking a 2-handed sword strike felt like catching a thrown pebble. His awareness expanded to encompass every angle of attack, every shift in his opponent's positioning, every opportunity for counterattack. And most importantly, his inhibitions fell away like discarded clothing. The first bandit died when Naruto's kunai found the gap between his ribs and his heart, sliding between bones with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of an executioner. The second lost his head to a follow-up strike that moved faster than the human eye could track. The third had enough time to scream before Naruto's palm strike caved in his sternum, stopping his heart instantly. The remaining bandits tried to flee, their predatory confidence evaporating in the face of violence that exceeded their own by several orders of magnitude. But enhanced by Kurama's chakra and freed from Konoha's restrictions on lethal force, Naruto was faster than panic-driven retreat. They died in the forest where they planned to kill him, their blood soaking in a soil that had probably absorbed the life of many previous victims. When it was over, Naruto stood alone in the pass, surrounded by 8 corpses and breathing hard from exertion that had been more psychological than physical. The borrowed chakra faded from his system, leaving him feeling oddly hollow and strangely satisfied. Now that kit was efficiency, no wasted motion, no hesitation, no mercy for those who would have shown you none. This is what real strength looks like when freed from artificial constraints. "I killed them," Naruto said, though whether he was making an observation or a confession wasn't entirely clear. "You defended yourself against predators who meant to murder you for sport. There is a difference, though I realize the distinction may be difficult to process given your village's peculiar notions about the sanctity of enemy life." Naruto looked down at the kunai in his hand, its blade now stained with blood that belonged to men who would never threaten another traveler. He'd killed before, of course. Missions sometimes required it, especially on the edge of the ninja world, where mercy was a liability. But those deaths had been in service to Konoha, justified by duty and necessity and the greater good. These deaths were different. He'd killed these men, not because a mission required it, not because his village demanded it, not because some higher authority had deemed them acceptable casualties. He'd killed them because they'd threatened him, and he decided their lives were worth less than his safety. It should have horrified him. Instead, he felt a calm satisfaction that was deeply disturbing in its completeness. You begin to understand the true nature of power, kid, not the sanitized version they taught you in that academy, where enemies conveniently survive to be reformed or redeemed. Real power means making permanent solutions to permanent problems. Is this what you wanted? Naruto asked. For me to become someone who kills without hesitation. I wanted you to become someone who survives without compromise. The willingness to kill when necessary is simply part of that evolution. Your village tried to make you into a weapon they could control. I am helping you become a weapon you can control yourself. As Naruto searched the bodies for anything useful, money, supplies, information, he found himself thinking about how his former teammates would react to this scene. Sakura would be horrified at the casual efficiency of the deaths. Kakashi would lecture him about the importance of restraint and the value of preserving enemy life when possible. But they weren't here, and their opinions no longer mattered. What mattered was that he was alive, uninjured, and in possession of enough coin and supplies to make his journey significantly easier. The bandits had been carrying more money than honest brigands should have had, along with wanted posters that suggested they'd been collecting bounties on various criminals and missing men. Apparently, they'd been operating as both bandits and bounty hunters, preying on travelers while supplementing their income with legitimate work. It was an interesting business model, and one that gave Naruto ideas about his own future employment opportunities. Back in Konoha, the morning shift of ANBU operatives was conducting their routine security sweep when they discovered that the Nine-Tails Jinchuriki had been absent from his apartment for several days. The discovery triggered immediate emergency protocols. Within minutes, Kakashi was standing in Naruto's small living space, staring at the note his former student had left behind with a growing sense of dread. I've got to find someplace where being myself is enough. Don't look for me. I won't be coming back. Naruto. How long? He asked the MBU operative who'd briefed him. Best estimate is 5 days, possibly 6. Neighbors reported not seeing him since the festival, but that wasn't unusual. He'd been keeping to himself lately. Kakashi closed his eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what had happened. Naruto, the Nine-Tails Jinchuriki, the village's most powerful weapon, the boy who'd sworn to become Hokage, had simply walked away from everything. No dramatic confrontation, no demands for reform, no final attempt to make his case for better treatment. Just a quiet exit and a brief note explaining that he was done. Inform the Hokage immediately, Kakashi ordered. Full emergency protocols. And send word to Jiraiya. He needs to know what's happened. As the ANBU operative departed to carry out his instructions, Kakashi remained in the apartment, studying the note and trying to understand how he'd failed so completely that his student had chosen exile over reconciliation. The answer, when he found it, was written in the things Naruto had left behind. Photographs of Team 7 that had been carefully placed face down on the dresser. Mission reports that had been sorted and stacked with a precision that suggested finality rather than organization. Personal items arranged with the deliberate care of someone who didn't expect to return. This hadn't been an impulsive decision made in a moment of emotional crisis. This had been a planned departure, thought through and executed with the kind of careful consideration that Naruto rarely applied to anything, which meant that somewhere along the way, he'd concluded that leaving Konoha wasn't just preferable to staying. It was necessary. Kakashi picked up one of the overturned photographs and looked at the image of his former team during happier times. 3 young faces smiled back at him, full of hope and determination and the kind of innocent optimism that the world seemed designed to crush. One of those faces belonged to a boy who'd walked away to join Orochimaru. Another belonged to a boy who'd walked away to find something Konoha couldn't provide. The third belonged to a girl who was probably in a hospital somewhere, throwing herself into medical training to avoid thinking about the teammates she'd lost. Team 7 was gone, destroyed as thoroughly as if they'd all died in battle. But unlike death, this destruction carried the weight of choices that might have been made differently, words that might have been spoken, support that might have been offered. Kakashi had failed 3 students in 3 different ways, and now the consequences of those failures were reshaping the ninja world in ways he couldn't predict or control. The worst part was that he understood exactly why Naruto had left. The boy's note wasn't a cry for help or a demand for attention. It was a simple statement of fact. He'd gone to find a place where being himself was enough, because Konoha had made it clear that it would never be such a place. "Hokage-sama wants to see you immediately," another ANBU operative announced from the doorway. "Emergency council session in 10 minutes. Kakashi took one last look around the apartment that had housed Konoha's greatest weapon and most tragic failure, then followed the operative toward what would undoubtedly be the most difficult briefing of his career. Behind him, dust motes danced in the afternoon, light streaming through windows that would remain closed for months to come, settling on belongings that no one would claim and photographs that no one would turn face up again. The apartment felt like a tomb, a memorial to possibilities that had died not through any single catastrophic failure, but through the slow accumulation of small neglects and casual cruelties that had finally become too much for one person to bear. 300 miles northeast of Konoha, Naruto made camp beside a mountain stream, using skills that were improving daily and supplies that had been significantly enhanced by his encounter with the bandits. The fire he built was efficient and well-constructed, the shelter he erected was weatherproof and concealed, and the meal he prepared from foraged plants and stream fish was both nutritious and satisfying. He was becoming competent at this life he'd chosen, learning through necessity and guided by an inner voice that never let him forget the lessons each challenge provided. "You're adapting well, Kit. Most village-trained ninja struggle considerably when forced to survive without support structures. Your progress has been impressive." "I had good teachers," Naruto replied, though he wasn't entirely sure if he meant his academy instructors or the harsh realities of wilderness survival. "The best teacher is experience, and the best experience is that which you survive to learn from." Today's encounter was educational in several important ways. Naruto nodded, poking at the fire with a stick while he considered the day's events. The fight with the bandits had been educational, but not in ways his village instructors would have approved of. He learned that he could kill efficiently when necessary, that Kurama's power was more accessible than ever before, and that he felt no guilt about eliminating people who posed a threat to his well-being. Most importantly, he learned that he was capable of surviving on his own terms, using his own judgment about what constituted acceptable behavior and necessary action. "Is this what you wanted?" he asked. "For me to become someone who doesn't hesitate to kill?" "I wanted you to become someone who makes decisions based on reality rather than ideology. Whether that involves killing depends entirely on the circumstances you encounter. Today, killing was the appropriate response to the threat you faced. Tomorrow, it may not be. And I'm supposed to decide that for myself?" "You're supposed to decide everything for yourself, Kit. That is what freedom means. The responsibility to make choices and live with their consequences, without the comfortable illusion that someone else's authority absolves you of moral weight." As Naruto settled into his bedroll and prepared for sleep, he found himself thinking about the bandits' faces in their final moments. Not with regret or guilt, but with a kind of detached analysis that would have alarmed anyone who'd known him in Konoha. They'd chosen to be predators. He'd chosen to be a more effective predator. The outcome had been determined by skill, power, and rather than moral considerations about the sanctity of life or the possibility of redemption. It was a simpler way of viewing the world, and increasingly, it felt more honest than the complex ethical framework his village had tried to impose on him. "Sleep well, Kit. Tomorrow brings new challenges and new opportunities to discover who you're becoming." I find myself curious to see what choices you'll make when faced with more complex moral situations. Naruto closed his eyes and let sleep claim him, unaware that his choices were already being observed by forces that viewed his transformation with great interest and growing satisfaction. The child of prophecy was walking away from the light, and those who served darker visions were beginning to take notice. Chapter 11. The Wanderer's Path. The town of Tanzaku Quarters had always been a place where questions weren't asked as long as money changed hands. Nestled in the borderlands between fire and hot water countries, it existed in the gray spaces between official jurisdictions, making it a natural haven for those who preferred to operate outside traditional structures, which made it perfect for Naruto's current needs. He'd arrived 2 weeks ago with little more than the supplies he'd taken from the dead bandits, but word of his capabilities had spread quickly through the underground networks that thrived in places like this. A lone ninja willing to take on jobs that others considered too dangerous or morally ambiguous was a valuable commodity in a town built on questionable enterprises. Another delivery job, Yamada said, sliding a scroll across the table of the dingy tavern where such business was typically conducted. The merchant was nervous, constantly glancing around as if expecting eavesdroppers, but his money was good and his requirements were simple. Discreet transport of sensitive materials to a contact in the next town over. Standard rates, no questions asked on either side. Naruto examined the scroll briefly, not enough to read its contents, but enough to assess its size and weight. Whatever sensitive materials meant in this context, they were compact enough to be easily concealed and transported. What kind of sensitive? He asked, though he suspected he already knew. The kind that certain people would prefer to keep moving rather than have intercepted by customs officials or rival interests, Yamada replied with the careful euphemisms that dominated this type of conversation. Smuggling, in other words. Probably weapons, possibly information, conceivably drugs, or other contraband. The specific nature of the cargo mattered less than the fact that someone was willing to pay well for its discreet transportation. Practical work, kid. No grand ideals about protecting the innocent or serving the greater good. Just straightforward application of your skills in exchange for material compensation. Much more honest than the missions your village assigned. Payment in advance. Naruto asked. Half now, half on delivery. Yamada produced a pouch of coins that felt substantial in Naruto's hand. The contact will have verification of the delivery before releasing final payment. It was more money than Naruto had ever seen for a single mission, certainly more than Konoha had ever paid him for far more dangerous assignments. The irony wasn't lost on him. Honest work had paid poorly while questionable work paid very well indeed. I'll take it, he said, pocketing both the money and the scroll. Excellent. One word of caution. There have been reports of increased ninja activity on the roads lately. Official patrols, bounty hunters, that sort of thing. Nothing you can't handle, I'm sure, but it's worth being aware of. After Yamada left, Naruto remained in the tavern nursing a cup of sake and considering his options. 2 weeks of mercenary work had been educational in ways his academy training had never covered. He'd learned that moral ambiguity was more lucrative than righteousness, that reputation mattered more than official certification, and that independence came with responsibilities that village support had previously handled. He'd also learned that he was good at this life, perhaps disturbingly so. First time I've seen someone order sake who looks like he should still be drinking milk. The voice belonged to a woman at the next table, middle-aged with graying hair and scars that spoke of considerable combat experience. Her clothes were nondescript but practical, and there was something about her posture that suggested she was accustomed to violence. First time I've seen someone drinking alone who looks like she's expecting trouble, Naruto replied without turning to face her directly. She laughed, a sound with genuine amusement in it. Fair enough. Mind if I join you? Professional courtesy among fellow freelancers. Naruto gestured to the empty chair across from him, curious about what this woman might want. In his experience, approaches from strangers in places like this were rarely social. "Akiko," she said, settling into the chair with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent years fighting. "Former Hidden Stone, currently unaffiliated. I've been hearing interesting stories about a young blonde ninja who handles difficult jobs with impressive efficiency." "Stories can be unreliable," Naruto said carefully. "True, but money talks louder than stories, and the people who've hired you recently seem very satisfied with the results." Akiko studied him with the kind of assessment that came from long experience evaluating potential threats and allies. "You're newer to this life than most, but you're adapting faster than anyone expects." "She's fishing for information, Kit, probably trying to determine whether you're competition, opportunity, or threat. Be cautious, but not hostile. Intelligence gathering works both ways." "What do you want?" Naruto asked directly. "To offer you something most people in our line of work never get: the benefit of experience without having to earn it through painful mistakes." Akiko took a long drink from her own cup before continuing. "You're talented, that's obvious. But talent without context gets people killed in this business. You need to understand the landscape you're operating in." "And you're offering to explain it to me?" "I'm offering to explain why a ninja your age is working freelance instead of serving a village, and why that particular combination is attracting attention from people you probably don't want noticing you." That got Naruto's full attention. He'd been careful to keep his background vague in his dealings with employers and contacts, but someone with experience might be able to read between the lines in ways he hadn't anticipated. "I left my village," he said simply. "Most ninja don't leave voluntarily. They get kicked out for disciplinary problems, or they flee to avoid punishment, or they're seduced away by promises of power or wealth." Akiko's eyes sharpened. "You don't fit any of those categories. You fight like someone with excellent training, but no institutional oversight. You take jobs that pay well, but don't serve any larger agenda. And you have an air of independence that suggests your departure was philosophical rather than practical." The assessment was uncomfortably accurate. Akiko had identified patterns in his behavior that revealed more about his background than he'd intended to share with anyone. "Impressive analysis, Kit. This one has considerable experience reading people and situations. Her offer of information may be worth considering." "What kind of attention am I attracting?" Naruto asked. "The wrong kind. Word is spreading about a young ninja with unusual power and no village affiliation. That combination makes certain organizations very interested. Groups that recruit independently powerful individuals for purposes that tend to be ambitious." "What kind of groups?" Akiko glanced around the tavern, confirming that their conversation wasn't being overheard, then leaned closer and lowered her voice. "Have you ever heard of the Akatsuki?" The name sent a chill down Naruto's spine. He'd heard references to the organization during briefings in Konoha, a group of S-class missing nin with unclear goals but demonstrated capabilities that made them a significant threat to village stability. "I've heard the name," he said carefully. "They collect powerful ninja the way other people collect rare weapons. Usually missing nin with specific abilities or bloodline limits. But sometimes they recruit directly from villages when they find someone who meets their criteria." Akiko's expression was grave. A young ninja with your apparent capabilities, operating without village oversight, would be exactly the kind of prospect they'd want to evaluate for potential recruitment. "Interesting. Others have noticed your growing power and independence. The question is whether this represents opportunity or threat." "Are you suggesting I'm being watched?" "I'm suggesting that in this business, paranoia is a survival skill. And I'm suggesting that you might want to be very careful about what jobs you take and who you associate with over the next few months." Naruto considered this information while finishing his sake. The idea that his activities were being monitored by unknown parties was disturbing, but not entirely surprising. He'd made no effort to hide his capabilities, and word traveled fast in the underground networks where he'd been finding work. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Professional courtesy, like I said, and because..." Akiko hesitated, as if deciding whether to reveal something personal. Because I recognize something in you that I saw in myself years ago. The look of someone who walked away from everything they'd known because staying would have destroyed them. What happened to you? Hidden Stone decided I was too independent, too willing to question orders that didn't make tactical sense. They tried to correct my attitude through increasingly punitive assignments. Eventually, I realized that loyalty to an institution that didn't respect my judgment was just another form of self-destruction. She shrugged, so I left. Been doing this work ever since. The parallel to his own situation was obvious, and Naruto found himself studying this woman with new interest. She'd made the same fundamental choice he had, abandoning village security for personal autonomy, and she'd apparently survived and even prospered in the years since. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Leaving? Never. The life is harder in some ways, easier in others. But it's mine, shaped by my choices rather than someone else's expectations." Akiko stood to leave, dropping coins on the table to cover her drinks. Word of advice: develop new techniques, ones that don't fit the standard patterns your village taught you. If you're going to operate independently, you need capabilities that can't be easily predicted or countered by people who know your background. After she left, Naruto remained in the tavern thinking about her warning and her advice. The idea that he was being observed by organizations like the Akatsuki was concerning, but the suggestion about developing new techniques was immediately appealing. Wise counsel, Kit. Your village training, while competent, was designed to produce predictable results within established parameters. True independence requires abilities that exist outside those parameters. What kind of abilities? Techniques that blend your natural skills with my power in ways your instructors never imagined. Combinations of human ingenuity and demonic energy that create entirely new possibilities for combat and infiltration. That evening, in a secluded training area outside town, Naruto began experimenting with exactly those kinds of combinations. The breakthrough came when he stopped trying to control Kurama's chakra and started trying to blend it with his own techniques on a fundamental level. Instead of using the fox's power as an enhancement to existing jutsu, he began creating new techniques that incorporated both human chakra manipulation and demonic energy from their initial conception. The results were unlike anything he'd learned in Konoha. Shadow Clone Jutsu, enhanced with traces of Kurama's chakra, produced clones that were faster, stronger, and more durable than anything he'd created before. More importantly, they could maintain a subtle connection to the original that allowed for real-time coordination in ways that standard clones couldn't achieve. Rasengan, infused with Fox chakra from the moment of formation rather than added afterward, became something entirely different. A sphere of energy that didn't just impact targets, but actively disrupted their chakra systems on contact. The technique was more complex to form, requiring conscious cooperation between human will and demonic power, but the results were devastatingly effective. Excellent progress, Kit. You're beginning to understand that true power comes not from suppressing or controlling my abilities, but from integrating them with your own until the combination becomes something entirely new. These techniques, they're not exactly human anymore, are they? Naruto asked, studying the way Kurama-enhanced chakra swirled around his hand in patterns that seemed to have their own intelligence. There's something between human and demon, something that has never existed before in the history of either species. You are becoming something new, Kit, not human, not fox, but a synthesis of both that surpasses either individual component. The philosophical implications of that statement were staggering, but Naruto found himself less disturbed by the idea than he probably should have been. His humanity had been questioned, rejected, and conditionally accepted for so many years that the prospect of transcending it entirely felt almost liberating. If being purely human meant being trapped by the limitations and expectations that had defined his life in Konoha, then perhaps being something more than human was an acceptable trade-off. He was deep in his training, working on a technique that combined shadow clones with foxfire chakra when he became aware that he was no longer alone in the clearing. The presence was subtle, expertly concealed, but Kurama's enhanced senses made hiding completely impossible. Someone was watching him from the tree line, observing his training with professional interest. "We are not alone, kid. Someone has been observing your progress for some time." "How long?" Naruto asked without stopping his practice, not wanting to alert the observer that he'd been detected. "Approximately 20 minutes. They arrived shortly after you began experimenting with the foxfire technique. Professional surveillance, very skilled." Rather than confront the observer directly, Naruto decided to put on a demonstration worth watching. He created a dozen shadow clones, each one infused with enough fox chakra to make them visibly different from standard techniques, and began practicing combat formations that showcased both power and tactical sophistication. The observer remained hidden, but Naruto could sense their continued attention throughout the display. When he finally ended the training session an hour later, the presence faded back into the forest without revealing itself. Impressive patience and professionalism, Kit. Whoever is watching you has considerable skill and specific interest in your capabilities. The question is whether they represent evaluation for recruitment or assessment for elimination. As Naruto gathered his gear and prepared to return to town, he found himself thinking about Akiko's warning about the Akatsuki. If powerful organizations were indeed taking interest in his activities, then his training sessions might be serving as auditions for opportunities he hadn't yet imagined. The thought should have been alarming. Instead, as he walked back toward Tanzaka quarters under a star-filled sky, he found himself curious about what kind of offer such an organization might make. Konoha had demanded his loyalty while withholding their acceptance. What would an organization that actively recruited power and independence offer someone who possessed both? Patience, kid. All questions are answered in their proper time. For now, continue to grow stronger, continue to develop your unique capabilities, and continue to establish your reputation as someone worth recruiting rather than eliminating. Back in town, Naruto completed his delivery mission without incident, collected his payment, and began considering what job to take next. The scroll's contents had been weapons-grade explosive tags, nothing that would destabilize entire regions, but dangerous enough to make their discreet transportation worthwhile. He was becoming comfortable with moral ambiguity, he realized. The absolute certainties that had defined his worldview in Konoha were giving way to more pragmatic considerations about what was necessary, profitable, and personally satisfying. It was a troubling evolution, but one that felt increasingly natural with each passing day. 300 miles away, in a hidden cave deep in the mountains of Rain Country, a figure with orange hair and ripple-pattern eyes listened to a report delivered by one of his most trusted subordinates. The Nine-Tails Jinchuriki has been operating as a freelance mercenary for 2 weeks, the subordinate reported. His capabilities have increased significantly since leaving Konoha, particularly in techniques that blend human jutsu with demon chakra. He shows no signs of attempting to return to his village, and his moral flexibility appears to be developing rapidly. Moral flexibility. He has accepted contracts involving smuggling, intimidation, and elimination of targets designated by his employers. No apparent ethical constraints beyond practical considerations about risk and payment. Payne nodded slowly, processing this information against his larger strategic goals. The Jinchuriki's departure from Konoha had created an unprecedented opportunity. Never before had someone with his power and potential been available for recruitment without the complications of village loyalty or institutional oversight. Continue surveillance. Do not approach directly, but ensure we have complete information about his activities, associations, and psychological state. When we make contact, I want to be certain our offer addresses his specific needs and motivations. And if other organizations attempt to recruit him first, then we will demonstrate why Akatsuki is the superior choice. But I doubt that will be necessary. From what you've described, the Jinchuriki is discovering the same truths about power and purpose that brought all of us to this organization. His recruitment will be a matter of timing, not persuasion. As his subordinate departed to continue their surveillance, Payne remained in the cavern, contemplating the possibilities represented by an unaffiliated Jinchuriki of such tremendous potential. The child of prophecy was walking away from the light, developing power without restraint, and learning to value results over ideology. Soon, very soon, it would be time to offer him a new purpose that matched his evolving understanding of how the world truly worked. And when that offer was made, Payne was confident that the boy who had once dreamed of becoming Hokage would find the vision of peace through pain far more compelling than anything his former village had ever provided. Chapter 12: Blood and Honor. The border dispute between Kasagawa and Minami had been simmering for 3 years, ever since a drought had forced both farming communities to compete for water rights from the same mountain stream. What had started as neighborly disagreements over irrigation schedules had escalated into armed skirmishes, burned crops, and the kind of generational hatred that turned practical problems into blood feuds. Neither village could afford to hire ninja from the major hidden villages. The fees were astronomical and the politics complicated. But they could afford a freelance mercenary with a growing reputation for solving problems efficiently and permanently. That's where Naruto came in. The situation is intolerable. Hayashi, the village elder of Kasagawa, explained as he led Naruto through fields that showed clear signs of recent violence. Irrigation channels have been deliberately damaged, storage buildings have been burned, and several fields bore the scorched earth marks of fire jutsu. They attack our farmers in broad daylight, steal our supplies, destroy our infrastructure. We need someone who can make them understand that this aggression cannot continue. What kind of understanding? Naruto asked, though he suspected he already knew what the old man wanted. The permanent kind, Hayashi replied without hesitation. We've tried negotiation, mediation, even involving the local magistrate. Nothing works. They see our reluctance to escalate as weakness, our attempts at peace as invitation for further attacks. Listen to his words, kid. This is how the world actually works. Not through noble speeches about peace and understanding, but through demonstrations of superior force that make continued aggression too costly to consider. They reached a hilltop that provided a clear view of both villages, separated by perhaps 2 miles of disputed farmland and the stream that caused all the trouble. Minami was slightly larger, with newer buildings and better fortifications, suggesting they'd been winning the economic war that accompanied the physical one. Show me what happened last week, Naruto said. Hayashi's expression darkened. 20 of their fighters hit our eastern fields at dawn, burned 3 storage buildings, destroyed the main irrigation pump, killed 2 of our young men who tried to stop them. They left a message saying it was retaliation for something we supposedly did to their livestock. Did you do something to their livestock? Of course not. We're farmers, not barbarians. But it wouldn't matter if we had. Every incident gets blamed on us. Every act of retaliation gets justified as necessary defense. Naruto studied the tactical situation with eyes trained by years of mission analysis. Minami held the high ground and better defensive positions. Kasagawa had more arable land, but was exposed to attack from multiple directions. The stream ran closer to Minami, giving them first access to the water that both communities needed. From a purely strategic perspective, Minami was winning because they understood that superior force trumped moral righteousness. Kasagawa was losing because they kept expecting fairness from people who had decided that victory mattered more than ethics. The stronger village takes what it needs. The weaker village suffers the consequences. This is the natural order that your village tried to hide behind pretty words about protection and justice. At least these farmers are honest about what they want. What exactly are you asking me to do? Naruto asked. And Hayashi said simply, whatever it takes, however you need to do it. We can't live with this constant threat hanging over us. and we can't fight a war against people who don't honor the basic rules of civilized conflict. The contract was straightforward. Eliminate Minami's capacity for continued aggression in exchange for payment that would keep Naruto comfortable for months. No moral complexity about protecting the innocent or serving the greater good. Just a simple transaction between people who wanted a problem solved and someone capable of solving it. I'll need detailed intelligence on their fighters, their defenses, and their daily routines, Naruto said. Already prepared. Hayashi produced a scroll containing maps, personnel assessments, and tactical analysis that was surprisingly thorough for farmers. We may not be warriors, but we're not fools. We know what kind of information professionals need. That evening, Naruto studied the intelligence while sitting in the inn room the village had provided. Minami had approximately 30 fighters of varying skill levels, mostly farmers with basic weapons training, but a few with genuine combat experience. Their leader was a former missing nin from Hidden Grass who'd settled in the village years ago and had been gradually militarizing their response to the water dispute. The missing nin was the real problem. Without his tactical knowledge and combat skills, the farmers would probably revert to the kind of low-level harassment that could be managed through deterrence rather than elimination. With him, they were capable of the kind of coordinated assault that had devastated Kasagawa's infrastructure. Remove the leader, and the followers lose both direction and confidence. Simple, efficient, effective. This is how real problems are solved, by identifying the source and eliminating it permanently. Just kill him, Naruto asked. Just kill him. His death will demonstrate to the others that their aggression carries consequences they cannot bear, while removing the strategic intelligence that makes their attacks effective. 2 problems solved with 1 action. The moral calculus was cleaner than anything Naruto had encountered during his village missions. No civilians to protect, no complex political considerations, no demands that he find non-lethal solutions to fundamentally lethal problems. Just a straightforward application of superior force to end a conflict that was destroying both communities. It was almost refreshing in its simplicity. Naruto struck just before dawn, when the guards would be tired and the village would be focused on preparing for the day's work rather than defending against attack. The missing nin's house was isolated on the village's eastern edge, positioned to provide early warning of assault from Kasagawa's direction. It was a tactically sound choice that unfortunately made the target easier to approach from unexpected angles. Naruto's enhanced speed and stealth capabilities, honed through weeks of operating without backup or support, allowed him to reach the building's roof without detection. From there, he could observe the interior through carefully created gaps in the tiles, mapping the layout and identifying the target's location. The missing nin was awake, sitting at a table reviewing what appeared to be plans for another attack on Kasagawa. He was older than Naruto had expected, perhaps 40, with the kind of scarred, weathered appearance that spoke of decades spent in violent pursuits. Not a desperate farmer driven to extremes by circumstances, but a professional warrior who'd found a new outlet for his skills. A predator who has discovered a hunting ground where his prey cannot effectively fight back. This is not a man driven by necessity, but by the enjoyment of domination. His death will be justice as much as strategy. Naruto dropped through the roof in complete silence, landing behind the missing nin with a kunai already in hand. The man had time to register the attack, but not to prevent it. The blade went between his ribs and into his heart with the precision of surgical technique and the finality of executioner's judgment. What? The missing nin tried to speak, but blood was already filling his lungs. Kasagawa sends their regards, Naruto said quietly, though he doubted the man could still understand him. It was over in less than 30 seconds. Professionnel, efficient, permanent. Excellent technique, quitte. Clean, quick, decisive. This is how problems are solved when diplomatic solutions prove inadequate. Naruto searched the house briefly, collecting intelligence about planned attacks and tactical assessments that would be useful for preventing future conflicts. Then he began the second phase of his mission, ensuring that Minami understood the consequences of continued aggression. He moved through the village like a ghost, leaving signs of his presence without revealing himself directly. Storage buildings that were mysteriously damaged overnight. Weapons caches that simply disappeared. Guard posts where the sentries were found unconscious with no memory of what had happened to them. By the time the sun rose and the missing Nin's body was discovered, Minami's capacity for organized assault had been systematically dismantled. Not through wholesale slaughter, but through surgical strikes that removed their ability to threaten Kasagawa while leaving the civilian population intact. The message was clear. Continued aggression would result in escalated consequences that they were not equipped to handle. The village council of Minami requested a meeting that same afternoon. Naruto arrived at the designated neutral ground, a small shrine situated halfway between the two communities, to find a group of nervous farmers accompanied by what appeared to be their most senior warrior. They had the look of people who'd been forced to confront realities they'd previously been able to ignore. "You're the one Kusagawa hired," the senior warrior said. It wasn't a question. "I'm the one they hired to solve their problem," Naruto confirmed. "Kenji is dead. Our weapons are gone. Half our stored supplies have vanished." The warrior's voice was carefully controlled, but fear leaked through despite his efforts. "We understand that you're capable of considerable efficiency. I'm capable of ending this conflict permanently if that's what's required. But I prefer a solution that allows both villages to focus on farming instead of fighting." The relief in their faces was obvious. They'd clearly expected demands for unconditional surrender or threats of complete destruction. "What are you proposing?" one of the council members asked. "Formal arbitration of the water rights dispute by a neutral magistrate, with both sides agreeing to abide by whatever decision is reached. Compensation to Kasagawa for the damage your attacks have caused. And a binding agreement that any future conflicts will be handled through legal channels rather than violence." Generous terms, Kit. You could demand much more from people who no longer possess the power to refuse. "And if we refuse?" the warrior asked. Naruto's expression didn't change, but something in his posture suggested that refusal would carry consequences that went far beyond their current problems. "Then I solve Kasagawa's problem using methods that are less diplomatic." The negotiation took 3 hours, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Minami agreed to all of Naruto's terms, along with a substantial payment to him personally for mediating the dispute rather than simply eliminating their capacity for further aggression. By evening, both villages had signed formal agreements that would end the conflict and establish frameworks for preventing future disputes. The water rights would be arbitrated by a neutral authority, damaged property would be compensated, and both communities could return to the business of farming rather than fighting. It was, by any reasonable measure, a successful resolution to a potentially devastating regional conflict. So why did Naruto feel no satisfaction at having prevented further bloodshed and established lasting peace between the communities? Because you understand, as they do, that peace was not achieved through appeals to their better nature or demonstrations of moral superiority. Peace was achieved through the application of superior force and the credible threat of escalated consequences. "Is that wrong?" Naruto asked as he prepared to leave the area. "Wrong, right? These are concepts that matter only to those who can afford the luxury of moral purity. What matters is results, and the results speak for themselves. Two villages that were destroying each other in a pointless conflict are now cooperating in productive enterprise. The strong imposed order on the weak, and everyone benefits." As Naruto walked away from the shrine where the agreements had been signed, he passed groups of farmers from both villages who watched him with expressions that were part gratitude, part fear, and part something else he couldn't quite identify. Respect, perhaps. The kind of respect that came not from affection or admiration, but from recognition of superior power and the restraint he'd shown in not using it to its full potential. Power brings respect, not friendship. This is the way the world works when stripped of comfortable illusions. You solved their problem, ended their conflict, and established lasting peace. The fact that they fear you more than they like you is irrelevant to the success of your intervention. That night, camped in a forest several miles from both villages, Naruto found himself thinking about the mission with a satisfaction that had nothing to do with heroic ideals or moral righteousness. He'd identified a problem, developed a solution, and implemented it with clinical efficiency. The results spoke for themselves. Peace where there had been war, cooperation where there had been conflict, order where there had been chaos. The methods he'd used would have horrified his former teammates and instructors, but the outcomes were objectively superior to anything diplomatic negotiation or moral suasion could have achieved. You're learning, kid. Power without the willingness to use it is meaningless. Mercy without the capacity for ruthlessness is weakness. The farmers understand this now, even if they prefer not to acknowledge it openly. I killed a man today, Naruto said, though whether he was making a confession or an observation wasn't entirely clear. You removed a source of conflict that was destroying two communities and would have eventually resulted in far more deaths than your single elimination prevented. The mathematics of violence are simple. One death now prevented dozens later. It was a pragmatic way of viewing the moral complexity of lethal force, and one that made considerably more sense than the abstract ethical frameworks his village had tried to impose on him. As sleep claimed him in his simple camp, Naruto dreamed not of the missing Nin's death or the fear in the farmer's eyes, but of the signed agreements and the prospect of fields that would grow crops instead of hosting battles. It had been a good day's work. And if that work had been accomplished through methods that would have appalled the boy who'd once sworn to become Hokage, well, that boy had never been very effective at actually solving problems, had he? Sleep well, kid. Tomorrow brings new opportunities to discover what you're capable of when freed from the constraints of false morality and institutional limitation. The world has many problems that could benefit from your particular skills. For the first time in months, that prospect filled him with anticipation rather than dread. Chapter 13, The Fox's Gambit. The bounty hunter calling himself Raiga had been tracking Naruto for 3 days. Not that Naruto had been particularly trying to hide. His reputation as an effective freelance problem solver had spread through the underground networks faster than he'd anticipated, and with reputation came both opportunities and complications. Apparently, someone had put a price on his head substantial enough to attract professionals with the skills to actually pose a threat. The realization came when Naruto's enhanced senses detected the same presence at 3 different locations along his route toward the border between fire and hot water countries. Professional surveillance was one thing. He'd grown accustomed to being observed by various interested parties. But this felt different, more focused, with the patient persistence of a predator closing in on prey. We're being hunted, kid. Whoever is tracking us has considerable skill and specific intent. This is not casual observation or intelligence gathering. How dangerous? Naruto asked, though he continued walking along the forest path as if unaware of the surveillance. Very. The stalker's chakra signature suggests significant combat experience and specialized techniques. Not a desperate amateur seeking easy money, but a professional who believes himself capable of collecting whatever bounty has been placed on our head. The confirmation of Naruto's suspicions came that evening, when he made camp beside a mountain stream, and his tracker finally decided to reveal himself. Uzumaki Naruto, a voice called from the darkness beyond his campfire's light. Also known as the Nine-Tails Jinchuriki, former ninja of the Hidden Leaf, current freelance mercenary with a growing reputation for efficient problem-solving. The man who stepped into the firelight was unlike any bounty hunter Naruto had encountered before. Tall and lean, with wild hair and eyes that held the kind of focused intensity that came from years spent in life-or-death situations. Most notably, he carried paired swords crackling with electrical energy, lightning-based weapons that suggested both considerable skill and access to rare equipment. Raiga of the Seven Swordsmen. The man continued, his weapons humming with barely contained power. Former Hidden Mist, currently unaffiliated. I believe someone is paying very well for your capture or elimination. Naruto recognized the title, if not the individual. The seven ninja swordsmen of the mist were legendary for both their skill and their brutality. Elite warriors who'd earned their reputation through decades of successful assassinations and small-scale wars. If one of them was hunting him, the bounty on his head was substantial enough to attract genuinely dangerous professionals. Capture or elimination? Naruto asked, standing slowly with his hands visible but ready to reach for weapons. Which pays better? Capture, actually. 50% bonus for bringing you in alive. Raiga's grin revealed sharpened teeth. But elimination is so much simpler, and dead targets don't try to escape during transport. This one is genuinely dangerous, Kit. His electrical techniques will be difficult to counter with standard approaches, and his experience gives him significant advantages in both strategy and timing. This may require deeper cooperation between us. Who's paying? Naruto asked, though he suspected the answer wouldn't change the immediate tactical situation. Anonymous commission through intermediaries. Could be your former village wanting their weapon back. Could be rivals eliminating competition. Could be collectors who specialize in exotic acquisitions. Raiga began moving in a wide circle around the campfire, his weapons leaving trails of electricity in the air. Doesn't really matter to me. Money is money, and you're worth enough to retire comfortably. The attack came without further warning. Lightning-fast strikes from both swords simultaneously, aimed to disable rather than kill, but delivered with enough force to incapacitate most opponents. Raiga was clearly confident in his ability to control the encounter's outcome. He was about to learn that confidence could be a fatal miscalculation. Naruto's first response was pure instinct. Shadow clones infused with enough Fox chakra to make them visibly different from standard techniques. But even enhanced, the clones were hard-pressed to match Raiga's speed and the reach advantage of his electrified weapons. Standard approaches will not suffice, Kit. This opponent requires our full cooperation, not just my power channeled through your techniques, but true partnership where your will and mine become one. Are you prepared for that level of integration? Naruto felt one of his clones dissipate under Raiga's assault. Then another, the feedback confirming that his opponent's weapons could disrupt chakra constructs on contact. Traditional strategies wouldn't work here. He needed something beyond anything he'd learned in Konoha or developed during his time as a freelancer. Yes, he said, both aloud and mentally. Do whatever you need to do. Then stop fighting my influence and embrace it. Stop trying to control the power and let it control you. Stop being Naruto, who occasionally uses the nine-tail strength, and becomes something entirely new. The transformation was unlike anything he'd experienced before. Instead of the painful burning sensation he associated with accessing Kurama's chakra, there was a smooth integration that felt like coming home to a place he'd never known existed. His awareness expanded beyond human limitations. His physical capabilities multiplied beyond recognition, and his tactical understanding became enhanced by instincts that had been honed over millennia of conflict. But most importantly, he was no longer fighting alone. Kurama's presence wasn't separate from his own consciousness. It was integrated with it, creating a synthesis that was more than the sum of its parts. When Raiga's next attack came, Naruto didn't dodge or block. He caught both electrified swords barehanded, his chakra-enhanced grip dispersing the electrical energy harmlessly, while his enhanced strength held weapons that could cut through steel. The bounty hunter's expression shifted from confidence to alarm in the space between one heartbeat and the next. What the hell? Raiga began, but Naruto was already moving. The counterattack was devastating in its simplicity, enhanced by Kurama's power and guided by the fox's combat instincts. Naruto simply released the swords and struck with an open palm that carried enough force to send a grown man flying 50 feet through the air. Raiga hit a tree with a sound like breaking wood, but he rolled with the impact and came up fighting, his weapons already moving in complex patterns designed to create distance and regain tactical advantage. It didn't matter. The person, entity, thing that Naruto had become was operating on a level that made traditional combat techniques irrelevant. Shadow clones materialized faster than Raiga could track them, each one infused with enough demonic energy to function as an independent combatant rather than a mere distraction. Foxfire chakra lanced through the air like guided projectiles, forcing the bounty hunter into increasingly desperate evasive maneuvers. And through it all, the original Naruto moved with predatory grace that made every step look effortless and every attack seem inevitable. Yes, kid, this is what true power feels like when freed from artificial constraints. This is what we can accomplish when we stop pretending to be separate entities. Raiga's electrical techniques, formidable against normal opponents, proved inadequate against someone whose chakra system was fundamentally different from baseline human norms. His speed and experience meant nothing against reflexes enhanced by demonic instincts and powered by nearly unlimited energy reserves. The end came when he made the mistake of trying to match Naruto's enhanced clones in direct combat. Surrounded and overwhelmed, he found himself held immobile by constructs that felt more like elemental forces than standard jutsu. Impossible, he gasped, staring at Naruto with the kind of fear usually reserved for natural disasters. No Jinchuriki integrates that completely with their sealed demon. The chakra poisoning alone should have killed you. Maybe I'm not like other Jinchuriki, Naruto replied, and his voice carried harmonics that belonged to both human and fox. What are you? Raiga whispered. I'm something new. The kill was quick and efficient, a chakra-enhanced strike that stopped the bounty hunter's heart instantly. But even as Raiga's body fell to the forest floor, Naruto could sense that the confrontation had been observed by others hidden in the surrounding darkness. Multiple observers, Kit. At least 3 distinct presences, all with considerable skill in concealment. We have attracted an audience. Rather than acknowledging the watchers directly, Naruto began the practical work of disposing of evidence and collecting anything useful from Raiga's equipment. The lightning swords were too distinctive to keep, but his money pouch was substantial and his travel supplies were of excellent quality. But as he worked, he was acutely aware of the eyes watching from the shadows, evaluating, assessing, drawing conclusions about what they'd witnessed. Let them watch, he decided. Let them see what happened to people who hunted him for money. Let word spread through whatever networks they represented that Naruto Uzumaki was no longer the desperate village exile they might have expected to find. He was something else now, something that had never existed before in the long history of Jinchuriki and their sealed demons. And that something was not to be trifled with by opportunistic bounty hunters or anyone else who mistook him for easy prey. From his concealed position 200 meters away, Hoshigaki Kisame observed the cleanup with professional appreciation. He'd been tracking the Jinchuriki for weeks as part of Akatsuki's evaluation process, documenting capabilities and psychological development to determine the optimal approach for eventual recruitment. What he'd witnessed tonight exceeded even the most optimistic projections of the boy's potential. The integration between human and demon had been seamless, creating a combat effectiveness that rivaled some of the legendary Sannin. More importantly, the boy had shown no hesitation about killing when threatened, no moral anguish about the necessity of violence, no attempt to find non-lethal alternatives to permanent solutions. He was becoming exactly what Akatsuki needed, powerful enough to serve their purposes, pragmatic enough to accept their methods, and isolated enough to appreciate what they offered. Impressive, Kisame murmured to himself, making mental notes that would become part of his next report to Pain. Very impressive indeed. The Jinchuriki finished his cleanup and resumed his journey north, moving with the confident ease of someone who no longer questioned his right to eliminate threats to his well-being. There was no regret in his posture, no indication that the evening's violence had troubled him psychologically. Perfect. Kisame waited until the boy was well out of sight before emerging from concealment. He had a report to deliver, and based on what he'd observed, Payne would want to accelerate their recruitment timeline significantly. The Ninetales Jinchuriki was ready, perhaps even eager, to hear what Akatsuki had to offer someone with his particular combination of power and pragmatism. The other witnesses to the battle were considerably less sanguine about what they'd seen. "Did you see the way he moved?" one whispered as they crept through the forest toward the nearest town. "That wasn't human speed or human strength." "The clones were wrong too," another added. "Shadow clones don't glow like that, don't move independently like that. What kind of technique creates constructs with their own intelligence?" And the way he killed Raiga, no hesitation, no emotion, like stepping on an insect. By the time they reached civilization, their story had already begun evolving into something closer to legend than factual report. The young blonde ninja who fought with demon fire and shadow creatures. The wanderer who killed one of the 7 swordsmen as easily as swatting a fly. The Jinchuriki who had somehow achieved perfect integration with a sealed beast. The story spread through the underground networks like wildfire, each retelling adding new details and escalating the threat assessment. Within days, every bounty hunter, missing nin, and criminal organization from Fire Country to the eastern borders would know that Naruto Uzumaki was no longer a target to be approached casually. He was a force of nature wrapped in human skin, and engaging with him required preparation for the possibility that the encounter might not end well for the challenger. Excellent, Kit. Fear is a far more effective deterrent than friendship ever was. Those who witnessed our partnership tonight will spread word that we are not to be trifled with. Future challenges will be fewer and of higher quality. Is that what we are now? Naruto asked as he made camp several miles from the battle site. Partners. We are whatever we choose to be, Kit. But yes, tonight we chose to be partners rather than reluctant cohabitants. The question is whether you find that transformation disturbing or liberating. Naruto considered the question while building his fire and preparing his evening meal. The integration with Kurama had felt natural, like accessing abilities he'd always possessed but never known how to use. There had been no sense of losing himself or being controlled by alien will, just the sensation of becoming more than he'd been before. Liberating, he said finally. Definitely liberating. Good, because there are others in this world who will recognize what we've become and seek to either recruit or eliminate us. Our next encounters will likely be with individuals who represent organizations rather than personal ambitions. Organizations like the Akatsuki, among others. The question is whether we approach such encounters as opportunities or threats. Power like ours is valuable to those with vision and ambition. The right alliance could provide resources, training, and purpose that independent operation cannot match. As he settled into his bedroll and prepared for sleep, Naruto found himself thinking about what kind of organization might value someone with his particular combination of abilities and moral flexibility. An organization that understood the practical applications of power. An organization that didn't waste time on moral complexities when simple solutions were available. An organization that could appreciate the advantages of someone who'd learned to integrate human cleverness with demonic strength. It was an intriguing prospect, and one that felt increasingly likely to manifest in the near future. After all, if he could sense the Watchers observing his battles, it was only logical that they were evaluating him for purposes beyond casual intelligence gathering. Sleep well, Kit. Tomorrow brings new possibilities and new challenges. But whatever comes, we face it together now, as true partners rather than reluctant allies. For the first time since leaving Konoha, that thought filled him with something approaching genuine anticipation. Chapter 14. Rumors and Legends. The stories began in the taverns and trading posts scattered across the borderlands between fire and hot water countries. Whispered accounts that grew more dramatic with each retelling. I heard it was 8 men he killed in that mountain pass, all of them at once. My cousin saw the aftermath, bodies everywhere, torn apart like wild animals had gotten to them. They say he moves faster than lightning, and his clones breathe fire. The Demon Fox Wanderer, that's what they're calling him. Young guy, blonde hair, fights with techniques that ain't natural. The merchants who carried these tales from town to town embellished them freely, understanding that dramatic stories were as valuable as trade goods and establishments that catered to people seeking distraction from hard lives. Within 2 weeks of the encounter with Raiga, every inn and tavern from the hot water border to the edges of rain country had heard some version of the legend. And like all legends, the truth became less important than the meaning people found in the telling. In the Hidden Leaf Village, the first credible reports reached Tsunade's desk on a Tuesday morning that started badly and got worse from there. Multiple confirmed sightings of a blonde ninja matching Uzumaki's description. The ANBU operative reported, his mask concealing whatever emotions the intelligence might have stirred, operating as a freelance mercenary throughout the border regions. Significant escalation in both capabilities and methods since his departure from the village. Tsunade set down her sake cup. It was barely noon, but the Naruto situation had been driving her to drink earlier and earlier each day, and focused on the report with the grim attention it deserved. Escalation how? Elimination of multiple targets with extreme prejudice. Destruction of infrastructure when tactically necessary. Use of techniques that don't match any known Konoha training protocols. The ANBU operative paused. Several witnesses describe abilities that suggest significant advancement in his relationship with a Nine-Tails entity. What kind of advancement? Integration Hokage-sama. Not the controlled channeling we've observed previously, but what appears to be voluntary partnership between human will and demonic power. The words hit Tsunade like a physical blow. She'd been afraid of something like this since the day they discovered Naruto's departure. That isolation and desperation would drive him toward deeper cooperation with the entity sealed inside him. The Nine-Tails was ancient, intelligent, and utterly without moral constraints when it came to achieving its goals. If Naruto was actively partnering with it rather than simply using its power, any indication of his ultimate destination or objectives? Negative Hokage-sama. His movements appear random, following opportunities for employment rather than any strategic plan. However, the operative hesitated. Spit it out. There are reports of increased Akatsuki activity in the same regions where he's been operating. Could be coincidence, but the timing suggests possible surveillance or evaluation for recruitment purposes. Tsunade's blood went cold. The idea of Naruto, with his power, his knowledge of Konoha's defenses, and his growing willingness to use lethal force. Falling into Akatsuki's hands was a nightmare scenario that made every other problem she faced seem trivial by comparison. Double the search teams, she ordered. Full authorization for whatever resources they need. And give me Kakashi. I want him personally leading the retrieval operation. Hokage-sama, should the teams be briefed for capture or other contingencies? The question hung in the air like a curse. Because the horrible truth was that if Naruto had truly allied himself with the Nine-Tails and was considering joining Akatsuki, retrieval might not be an option. The threat he represented to village security could exceed his value as a weapon in their service. Capture if possible, she said finally. But team safety takes priority over target preservation. After the operative left, Tsunade sat alone in her office, contemplating the magnitude of her failure. She'd let her disappointment and frustration drive away the village's most powerful asset, and now that asset was becoming a potential threat that might require elimination to prevent catastrophic consequences. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. In trying to discipline Naruto into becoming a better weapon, she'd driven him to become a weapon pointed at their own hearts. Kakashi received the mission briefing 2 hours later, in a secure conference room where Jiraiya was waiting with an expression that mixed determination with barely concealed dread. The trail is approximately 2 weeks old, Kakashi reported, spreading maps across the table that showed confirmed sightings and probable routes. He's been moving northeast, following trade routes, and taking mercenary contracts. Standard freelancer pattern, except for the dramatically enhanced capabilities and complete willingness to use lethal force. How enhanced? Jiraiya asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer would be worse than he wanted to hear. Witnesses describe techniques that blend standard jutsu with what can only be Nine-Tails chakra in ways we've never seen before. Shadow clones that operate independently, elemental manipulation that exceeds known human capabilities, physical enhancement that rivals the strongest taijutsu specialists. Jiraiya closed his eyes, undoubtedly thinking about the prophecy that had driven so much of his relationship with Naruto. The child who would bring either peace or destruction to the world, and who seemed to be choosing the latter path with devastating efficiency. Integration level? He asked. Unknown, but probably advanced. The reports suggest voluntary cooperation rather than force channeling. He's not fighting the Nine-Tails anymore. He's working with it. Then we may already be too late, Jiraiya said quietly. Once a Jinchuriki achieves that level of integration, extraction becomes nearly impossible without killing both the host and the sealed entity. Are you suggesting we shouldn't try to bring him home? I'm suggesting we need to be prepared for the possibility that the boy we're looking for no longer exists. If he's truly partnered with the Nine-Tails, then what we're tracking isn't Naruto, who occasionally uses demon power. It's a hybrid entity that thinks with human intelligence and acts with demonic instincts. Kakashi studied the map, trying to project Naruto's likely route based on the pattern of sightings and mercenary activities. The path led northeast toward increasingly lawless territories where questions weren't asked and official authority was scarce. Perfect hunting grounds for someone who wanted to operate without oversight or interference. How long before we can intercept him? If we move fast and guess right about his destination, maybe 3 days. But Kakashi, Jiraiya's voice carried the weight of long experience and recent heartbreak. We need to discuss what happens if he doesn't want to come home. The question that neither of them wanted to voice directly. What did you do when your most powerful weapon decided to point itself at you instead of your enemies? He's still our student, Kakashi said, though the words felt hollow even to him. He's still the Nine-Tails Jinchuriki, Jiraiya replied. And if he's made a deliberate choice to ally himself with the entity inside him, then student-teacher relationships become secondary to village security. They spent the next hour planning routes, resources, and contingencies for a mission that felt more like a potential assassination than a rescue operation. Both men understood the stakes involved. If they succeeded in bringing Naruto home, they might save both him and the village from catastrophic consequences. If they failed, or if he proved too dangerous to approach safely, they would have to make choices that would haunt them for whatever remained of their lives. One more thing, Jiraiya said as they prepared to depart. Intelligence reports suggest Akatsuki operatives have been spotted in the same general area. If they're evaluating Naruto for recruitment, then we're racing against time, Kakashi finished. And if they get to him first, retrieval becomes infinitely more complicated. An understatement of staggering proportions. If Naruto joined Akatsuki willingly, with full integration of Nine-Tails' power and complete knowledge of Konoha's defenses and capabilities, the resulting threat would exceed anything the village had faced since its founding. As they left the village gates with their carefully chosen team, neither man spoke about the possibility that they might be embarking on their final mission as Konoha ninja. Because if Naruto had truly chosen darkness over light, if he'd embraced partnership with the Nine-Tails and was considering alliance with Akatsuki, then stopping him might require sacrifices that would destroy the people, making them as surely as any enemy attack. The hunt for the Nine-Tails Jinchuriki had begun, and everyone involved understood that it might end with the death of either the prey or the predators. In the hidden depths of Rain Country, Pain listened to Kisame's latest report with growing satisfaction. The Jinchuriki's transformation continues to exceed our projections, Kisame reported, his shark-like features animated with genuine enthusiasm. Full integration with the Ninetales entity demonstrated tactical flexibility, complete willingness to eliminate threats permanently. He's becoming exactly what we need. And his psychological state? Stable, for what I can observe. No signs of the mental degradation that typically accompanies advanced Jinchuriki integration. If anything, he seems more focused and decisive than the reports from his village days suggested. Pain nodded slowly, processing this information against the larger strategic picture that drove all of Akatsuki's operations. A willing recruit with Ninetales power would be invaluable for their ultimate goals, but only if that recruit could be trusted to prioritize organizational objectives over personal considerations. What about his former village? Any indication they're attempting retrieval? Intelligence suggests they're mobilizing search teams, probably led by his former instructor. But they're at least 2 weeks behind his current position, and their approach will be hampered by attempting to minimize civilian casualties and preserve target viability for return to service. Weaknesses we don't share, Payne observed. Exactly. If we move now, we can make contact before any rescue attempt reaches him. And given his current psychological state, I believe he'll be receptive to what we can offer. Payne considered this assessment while studying reports from other Akatsuki operations across the region. The timing was indeed optimal. The Jinchuriki was isolated, powerful, and apparently free from moral constraints that might interfere with their methods. He demonstrated both capability and pragmatism, the two qualities most essential for Akatsuki recruitment. Initiate direct contact, he decided, but approach carefully. We want him to choose us rather than feeling coerced. Someone with his power and current mindset will respond better to respect and opportunity than to threats or manipulation. Understood. Any specific parameters for the recruitment offer? Full membership, equal status, resources commensurate with his abilities. Make it clear that we value what he's become rather than trying to change him back into what he was. After Kisame departed to carry out his orders, Pain remained in the hidden chamber, contemplating the strategic advantages represented by willing Ninetales integration. Every previous Jinchuriki they'd encountered had been fighting their sealed entity, limiting both power and tactical flexibility. This one was different. This one had chosen partnership over resistance, cooperation over control. The resulting capabilities would exceed anything they'd previously incorporated into their organization. The child of prophecy was walking toward them of his own accord, driven not by their manipulation, but by the natural consequences of his village's failures and his own evolution beyond their limiting expectations. Soon, very soon, he would have the chance to discover what Akatsuki could offer someone who'd outgrown the need for conventional morality and traditional loyalty. Payne suspected the offer would be very well received indeed. 200 miles northeast of Konoha, Naruto sat beside another campfire in another forest clearing, unaware that he'd become the focus of multiple organizations' attention and planning. His evening had been spent practicing techniques that blended his own chakra manipulation with Kurama's power in increasingly sophisticated ways. The fox had proven to be an excellent teacher once their relationship had evolved beyond reluctant coexistence in a genuine partnership. Your progress continues to exceed expectations, Kit. The integration techniques you've developed tonight would have taken most Jinchuriki years to master, assuming they ever achieved such cooperation at all. It feels natural, Naruto replied, studying the way Foxfire chakra swirled around his hand in patterns that seemed to have their own intelligence. Like this is what I was always meant to become. Perhaps it is. Your village saw you as a weapon to be controlled, but weapons are limited by their wielder's imagination and courage. Partnership creates possibilities that neither human nor demon could achieve alone. As if summoned by their conversation about possibilities, Naruto's enhanced senses detected a presence approaching through the darkness. Careful, professional, but making no real effort at concealment. Whoever was coming wanted to be noticed, which suggested either confidence or stupidity. Single individual, considerable power, no immediate hostile intent. This one approaches for conversation rather than combat. Should I be worried? Naruto asked. That depends entirely on what they want to discuss. But I suggest you listen to what they have to say. Opportunities rarely announce themselves so politely. The figure that emerged from the tree was immediately recognizable from the wanted posters Naruto had seen during his mercenary activities. Tall, blue-skinned, with a massive wrapped sword strapped to his back, and the kind of predatory grace that marked truly dangerous individuals. Hoshigaki Kisame, one of the 7 ninja swordsmen of the mist, and a confirmed S-class missing nin with a bounty that exceeded the annual budgets of most small villages. Good evening, Kisame said with genuine courtesy, stopping at the edge of Naruto's firelight. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Depends on what you want, Naruto replied, neither welcoming nor hostile. If you're here for the bounty, you should know that the last professional who tried that approach didn't survive the attempt. I heard about Raiga. Impressive work. Kisame's shark-like grin revealed rows of pointed teeth. But I'm not here for bounty collection. I'm here to make you an offer that I think you'll find considerably more interesting than anything the freelance market can provide. This is a kit, the approach we've been expecting. Listen carefully to what he proposes. It may represent exactly the opportunity we've been seeking. What kind of offer? Naruto asked. The kind that comes from an organization that values strength over sentiment, results over rhetoric, and practical solutions over moral complexity. Kisame settled into a relaxed crouch across the fire from Naruto. An organization that's been watching your recent activities with considerable admiration and growing interest. Akatsuki, Naruto said. It wasn't a question. Akatsuki, Kisame confirmed. We've been impressed by your evolution since leaving the Hidden Leaf. Your integration with the Nine Tails, your tactical flexibility, your willingness to make permanent solutions to permanent problems. These are qualities we value highly. And what exactly are you offering? Partnership with individuals who share your pragmatic approach to problem solving. Resources and training that will help you develop your unique abilities to their full potential. Purpose that matches your power rather than limiting it to politically acceptable applications.